Low-dimensional game. Chapter 1 to 20. I am sorry to tell you that you have lung cancer. But, if you receive treatment, there is still a chance of recovery. Does your family know about it? We suggest that you be admitted to the hospital and receive treatment. How long do I have left? You have most likely contracted it for some time. But, there is still. Lu Zhu walked out of the hospital in a daze. It seemed unreal, like a dream. The people who walked past him were like from a different world, as if there was an invisible boundary that separated him from reality. Lu Zhu had no intention of starting any treatments. He had cancer, there was no point in wasting money to treat it. Even if he were to die, he did not want to die in agony on a hospital bed, with tubes inserted into his body. Since his youth, Lu Zhu's lungs had not been healthy. He coughed often. After having worked in the capital for a few years, whenever there was smog, his cough would get worse. He had wanted to leave the capital for a while, but he had reached the height of his career, so he kept putting it off. Recently, his symptoms had become more severe, but Lu Zhu had shrugged it off. He had not expected things to turn out this way. After he resigned from his job, Lu Zhu bought a flight ticket and made his way home, back to Jiangcheng. Lu Zhu was born in Jiangcheng, and his home was an old house with its own entrance and courtyard. It looked very modern after some renovations, but because no one was living there, the courtyard currently looked unkempt and lifeless. Lu Zhu's parents had passed away a long time ago and he did not have any close relatives. He had also gradually lost touch with his good friends from school after he entered the workforce. When they had run into each other again after a number of years, the once close friends had become calculating and distant, not as they were before. Some things were just better kept as memories in the past. As for his colleagues, they were friendly to each other in the office, but Lu Zhu could no longer open up his heart as easily as he did in his youth. After giving it some thought, Lu Zhu felt that his life was very pointless. It seemed like there was a standard life template, which had been applied to millions of others, was also forced on him. Other than this cancer incident, he had been living like a puppet, directed by people, society, and fate. The house had been vacant for a long while and was filled with dust. After removing the furniture covers, he started to clean up. He found quite a number of old items. Toys, textbooks, and drawings were revealed, and they brought back many memories from his childhood. What is this? He found an old, red, wooden box on a shelf in the storeroom. After opening it, he found that it was filled with several things. There was a badge of the head of a peasant, an ink slab, and a red book. What most caught Lu Zhu's attention, however, was a white scroll. The scroll was unusually white and without a single blemish. The quality of the paper was so fine that it shimmered as if it had been brushed with a layer of oil. When a piece of paper had been around for a long time, the color would change, and this scroll seemed to have been left in the box for a long time without proper care, but it was surprisingly well maintained. These items must have been left behind by his grandfather. Lu Zhu was curious to find out what had been painted on the scroll. He slowly spread it out on the table in the living room, but his anticipation quickly turned into disappointment. What? It is empty. As Lu Zhu was about to store it away, he realized that there was a black dot on the scroll. As he took a closer look, he realized that it was a tiny grasshopper. Lu Zhu let out a laughter. This is such a big scroll, but such a tiny grasshopper has been drawn on it. What a waste! After taking a good look at it, Lu Zhu touched the grasshopper with his hand. At this instant, a shocking thing happened. It was as if his hand had moved into another space and he felt something. Lu Zhu was shocked and withdrew his hand. He was even more shocked to see a grasshopper now in his hand. He exclaimed with surprise, "What the heck is this?" As he let go of the grasshopper, he saw that it immediately jumped up and hopped around the living room. Lu Zhu stared at it in disbelief. He rose to his feet and looked at the scroll. The grasshopper that had been painted on the scroll had now disappeared. Have I taken it out? Was it alive? Lu Zhu looked at the painting, then looked back at the grasshopper. His jaw dropped, and he realized that he had found a treasure. Lu Zhu liked to read on the internet. In fact, He had the habit of reading for an hour every night, so he was no stranger to such things happening. A fantasy has come alive? A magic item that can store things? A treasure that can open to another world? Although he was about to die, Luza did not give up on himself, nor did he complain. Life had to go on, especially when his remaining days were numbered. He wanted to live a fulfilling life and was elated to find such an interesting item at this moment. Luza spent a few days experimenting on the scroll. It was clear that there was a space in the painting. However, it was different from what he had at first thought. He called it the painting space. The surface of the space was flat. From a scientific point of view, this was not a three but a two-dimensional space. All the things that had entered this space would automatically be sealed and collapse into a two-dimensional form. However, after leaving this space, they would return to their original form. Luza found it hard to understand how this all happened. This was his first discovery. He came to this conclusion after putting different things into the painting space. And his second discovery was that, in the two-dimensional world, it seemed like time did not exist. Everything that went in, seemed to have gone into an eternal rest river, and even if they had been kept inside the scroll for a long period of time, they remained the same. The third discovery was that the painting space seemed to reject living things. Luza had tried to put living things into the space, but it could not take living things that were too big. He had put a chicken and a duck into it, but they had been torn apart and had disappeared. Luza suspected that the entrance of the space could not support their sizes and had caused them to go into a dimensional gap. However, when he put a few ants in the painting space, this same predicament did not occur. The ants stopped moving and had been sealed. Luza found it puzzling that time did not exist in the two-dimensional space. If time had existed, it would have become another world. The painting space would have been more meaningful, rather than just acting as a storage space. Einstein's theory of relativity had classified time as an independent dimension. According to this theory, mankind should be living in the four-dimensional space. However, man was unable to observe the fourth dimension, time, so they belonged to the three-dimensional space. The two-dimensional world was similar. Even if one could not observe time, it should still exist and should not just disappear like this. Luza had decided to look at it from a different perspective and to confirm if this was so. Luza had decided to look at it from the three axioms of the theory of the universe: time, T, space, U, and matter, M. Time, space and matter were tightly related to each other one another. The three elements were independent yet inextricably linked. The relationship between space and time was U equals UT, and M equals MU for matter and space. Time was found in space, and space was filled with matter. Thus, time and space were related to matter. Among the three elements, matter was the primeval element. If there was no matter, space would never have existed. If space did not exist, time would never have existed. Luza suspected that this painting was the entrance to a two-dimensional world. As matter did not exist in this two-dimensional world, space and time likewise did not exist. Luza looked at the painting, finding it inconceivable. He seemed to have found the entrance of a new world. He wondered, if I place large amount of matter into the two-dimensional space, would I create a stable two-dimensional world? A two-dimensional world with time and space, and also be able to sustain lives? Luza felt excited at this thought, so he started to make a plan. He would first try to put a pipeline into the painting space, then transport sand and other things into it. At this moment, someone pressed on the doorbell. He looked down and saw that the courier was there. "Are you Luza? Please sign for the parcel," the courier requested, in a friendly and polite tone. The parcel contained the camera that he had ordered. After linking it up with his computer, Luza put the camera into the painting space. He wanted to find out what was inside the painting space instead of observing it from the surface of the painting. The moment camera was put inside the painting space, the computer screen went dark. Luza's heart sank, but he had anticipated this reaction. Firstly, there was no light in the two-dimensional space, so he was prepared to see nothing. Secondly, He had a feeling that most likely the signals could not be sent out from the two-dimensional world, otherwise it would be too inconceivable. Although Luza felt this way, he still just wanted to give it a shot. After Luza clicked on the mouse and turned on the light on the camera, the computer screen brightened. Luza's jaw dropped in surprise, then he moved the camera around. "I can't believe something actually showed on the computer screen." The images on the screen looked strange. The camera seemed to have captured the images, but what he saw was a flat side view. The camera had captured its own image. What angle is this? There was nothing on the screen except darkness and a straight tray of light. It was like a 2D horizontal animation or caricature. At this very moment, Luza saw a shadow flash across the screen. What was that? He quickly shifted the focus and found that there was a special sigil on the screen, a horizontal 8. Luza knew that this symbol meant infinity. However, in the capital city, the mark also represented smog. Luza was certain that he had seen it correctly. It must mean infinity. The sigil was in the center of the painting space. No matter from which angle Luza looked, he could only see the front view. He found the situation in the painting space mysterious. He was certain that it was a two-dimensional space, but from what the camera had captured, it did not seem like a two-dimensional perspective. However, it was definitely not a three-dimensional one. Luza had never entered a two-dimensional space, so he did not know exactly what a two-dimensional space should be. He retrieved the camera and saw that the part of the camera that had disappeared into the painting space seemed to be rebuilding itself until it finally reappeared in the three-dimensional world. This occurrence was nothing new to Luza, so he was not surprised. After pondering things for a while, he decided to remove the horizontal aid to have a closer look. This was the first time that Luza had placed his hand inside, and it had required much courage. If he could not pull his hand back out, he would be in deep trouble. He felt strange, when his hand was in the painting space. He seemed to have lost his sense of touch, yet he could still feel his hand. His hand became light, like a piece of paper. "I have caught it." Luza was elated, and quickly pulled the thing out. However, when he looked at his hand, it was empty. What happened? Where is it? Luza turned his hand around and saw the silver dot. It moved between the surface of his skin and his flesh without resistance, as if his flesh and blood did not exist. It flopped around on his hand like a fish, then moved up his arm. FCK. 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 Luza was frightened, so he kept hitting and scratching his arm, but was unable to feel the thing. He saw it crawling up his arm, so he quickly dashed into another room and held up a mirror. The thing had reached his neck, crawled up to his face, and ultimately, entered his brain. Bang! Luza felt as though something in his head had exploded, and he lost consciousness. It was as if he had seen the explosion of the universe, resulting in endless of information being sent to his brain. However, the information was too much for the capacity of his brain. The information passed through his brain but could not be kept. Ultimately, only a small, vital portion remained in his memory. When Luza got up from the ground, it was dark. He felt that although he had remained calm to face death, but was still quite terrified by the fact that something so strange had gone into his body. However, after giving it some thought, he was able to shrug it off. It was just like the cancer cells. Worst case, he would die. The thing that had entered his brain must be the controlling power of the painting. It represented the ownership and the control center of that two-dimensional world. Luza could sense that there was tons of information, such as detailed explanation and operation manual, available to him. He felt the information was as much as what was stored in the National Library of China, yet he was unable to load all of it into his brain at the moment. He only learned some simple operations, but had left the rest behind. That being said, he now understood how to open and enter the two-dimensional space, and how to set up the internal rules and variants for it. During the night, Luza drove his BYD to Melanshan, which was near the lake where land was rich and fertile. Luza had even felt the soil with his hand. After he had chosen the place, Luza started to carry out his first plan to steal some soil. He had intended to use agricultural soil to prevent infestation problems, but it was too costly. With the amount of soil that he needed, even $10,000 would not be enough. The air in Melanchthon was fresh, so it would be very nice to come in the morning. However, it was in the middle of the night at the moment. As the cold wind blew, it sounded like the moaning of spirits, and made the place quite scary. Luza was a bit nervous, but not because he was stealing the soil, but because he was about to open the entrance to the painting space. This also happened to be the entrance to a two-dimensional world which was trapped by the force field of the Scroll of the World. Yes, Luza decided to name the painting the Scroll of the World. The moment that the entrance opened, there would be a gap in the force field. If he was unable to control it, the consequences would be dire. Earlier, Luzu had sought advice from others in internet forums, questioning them about how to best design a two-dimensional world. When he asked what could go wrong after opening the entrance, someone from the forum asked him warily, "Hey, buddy, have you ever heard of the dual vector foil?" When Luzu thought of what he had in his hands, he swallowed hard. This thing could destroy the solar system at any given time. When he was ready, the silver sigil in his brain flashed. He saw a black whirlpool appear on the Scroll of the World. Its powerful suction pulled at everything within the radius of half a mile. Enough. That's enough. During the few minutes the wind whipped through the air, Luza found it difficult to keep his eyes open. He even found it hard to breathe. Much of the air within a radius of 1 kilometer had been drawn away, causing the air to thin. After opening his eyes, Luza saw that the gigantic hill had turned into a cliff. The water of the lake was at its base, but the water level was slowly rising. Luza was stunned, and quickly stored away the Scroll of the World for safekeeping, then left the hill by a detour. After reaching the foot of the hill, he hopped into his car and hurriedly left. The following day, it was reported in the news that, after the analysis of the experts, it had been concluded that a syndicate had stolen the soil. The experts strongly voiced their displeasure over such an action. However, none of this had anything to do with Luzu. He had hung his Scroll of the World, which was now no longer empty, on a shelf in his bedroom. Pictured upon it was a small island, surrounded by the swaying sea. The water had been drawn from the lake, so there should have been numerous fish in the water, but they had all disappeared. It was apparent that the painting space could only bear the weight and girth of tiny living things. With the help of the sigil in his brain, Luzu had spent the whole night separating the objects from the water, completely setting up a stable world. However, the sigil had gradually lost its silver color. It used to be bright, but it had faded, as if the changes made to the painting space had consumed its power. But even now, Luzu still remained baffled over its power. As he looked at the painting, he saw ants crawling within it. He jumped up with excitement, exclaiming, "This is exactly what I thought! Space is determined by matter, and time is determined by space." Finally, there was stable space established within the scroll. As Luzu observed the ants, he realized that they were moving around like the characters in 2D video games. There was nothing unusual about their behavior. They had probably lost their three-dimensional senses, as they were living within the two-dimensional world. Another possibility was that they were two-dimensional creatures. However, the two-dimensional world still seemed lifeless. It was nothing like the real, human world. In the twinkle of an eye, the ants began to die. Luzu knew this was due to the lack of sun, lack of warmth, and the lack of fresh air. As soon as time started to pass in the painting space, the ants and some bugs started to die and disappear, which took Luzu by surprise. Warmth? Sun? Luzu found it bizarre. He could not create a sun. Or could I? Why not? Although he had control over the painting space, he was unclear about the logistics of its overall operations. With the power of the silver sigil, it just might be possible to create a sun. Since it is the two-dimensional space, can I just draw a sun? Luzu had a whimsical thought, leading him to quickly draw a sun in the sky with red paint. Upon doing so, he immediately felt a depletion of energy in the silver sigil. A third of the energy was consumed. He was excited to see that the sun in the painting space started to move in accordance with the parameters that he had set. He then added a blue moon, and the sun and the moon followed a circular path, which formed night and day. The two-dimensional space had started to stabilize in accordance to Lucy's design. He took things one step further, starting with bigger, bolder plans. Since the parameters in the two-dimensional world could be adjusted, time should also be adjustable. Time was the reflection of the movements of an object. If there was no object or energy in space, time would not exist, and hence, it would be meaningless. Only when were objects in the world, and the movements of the objects compared to each other, the meaning of time could then be represented. The movements of the molecules, atoms, electrons and photons were the components that created the aging process. From the small changes such as minuscule decaying process caused by mold and the ticking of the clock, to the significant changes such as rotation of the Earth and the changes in the Milky Way, all these movements formed the concept of time. If the objects did not move, time would stop. If the objects moved at a faster speed, time would then sped up. If the objects slowed down, the passage of time would likewise slow. Lucy was filled with excitement. If I can increase the movements of the objects in the two-dimensional space, time would speed up, too. 1 day in the outside world could be equivalent to 1 year, or even 10 years, in the two-dimensional space. Is this possible? I will give it a try. Lucy started to research on the internet, jotting down his ideas in a notebook. He then crossed out and ticked off some of these ideas. After spending 2 weeks on this project, he had finalized his thoughts. Whether or not he would succeed, that was still in question. As he sat in front of the scroll of the world, he shut his eyes. He focused on the sigil in his consciousness, sensing the world inside the painting space. The entire two-dimensional world was set up based on the parameters and changes he defined. The size and data of the two-dimensional world all flooded into his brain, including how much is the gravity, the temperature of the sun, the time of the day, and the change of 4 seasons. Lucy felt that he was like a god creating a world. He injected his thoughts into the silver sigil and exerted control over the two-dimensional world. As he did so, the energy of the silver sigil continued to deplete. Only now did Lucy set up the two-dimensional world based on his design. Suddenly, he heard the clock strike. Time had started to move like the pointer in the timepiece. The speed became faster, and when Lucy opened his eyes, he saw that the realm within the two-dimensional world had filled with color, started to function, and had come to life. Time continued to move faster, but before Lucy had used up all of his energy, he stopped and fixed the time parameters. Every amendment to which required large amounts of energy. Lucy had set time to a pace which moved 10,000 times faster than the outside world. Time and the 4 seasons had been set according to the data of the outside world. Hence, 1 day in the outside world was equivalent to 27 years in the two-dimensional world. Now, 1 hour would be equivalent to more than a year in the painting space. As Lucy looked at the land in the painting space, he saw that the seeds among the trees and plants had started to sprout. In 1 hour, the entire island was filled with green. Lucy took a bottle, went to the courtyard, and filled it with some ants. Time and gravity were present in the painting space as were the sun and moon, the 4 seasons, and plants and oxygen, but there were no animals. Lucy decided to put some specimens into the painting space himself. At this moment, he heard a voice outside the gate. "Lucy, what brings you home?" Lucy stood up and saw a girl with a wine-red helmet, sitting on a motorbike outside the gate. She was staring at him, surprised. Lucy put down his short-handled hoe and bottle and walked to the door. "You are?" The girl removed her helmet at once and said, "I am Sci-fi." Lucy was embarrassed. The girl was pretty and looked familiar, but he could not remember her and did not know what to say. Suddenly, he remembered a joke that he had read from the internet. A teacher met a student, but both of them could not remember each other's name. The student could only say, "I remember you, that teacher. You are that student." Sci-fi looked at Lucy in disappointment for a while, then she put the helmet under her armpit. "Hey, don't you remember me?" Luzu was extremely embarrassed. I'm getting old and my memory has failed me. Can you tell me who you are? I am Xian's younger sister. Luzu looked at her and said, Xian's sister? Luzu gestured with his hand and said, you have grown up. Xiafan immediately replied, of course, I'm in high school now. Xian was Luzu's first love. Given his situation, Luzu had no wish to meet any old friends or relatives and just wanted to spend his remaining days alone, not to mention a person like Xiafan. When Luzu was dating Xian, Xiafan was in primary school. Luzu had not contacted Xian for 6 or 7 years. Ever since they graduated from high school, they had gone their separate ways. Xian went to Peking University, and Luzu had gone to a normal university. Xian had made things very clear when they broke up. Luzu had not been able to get over it back then, but during the past 2 years, he was able to come to terms with it. However, that did not mean that he wished to see her again. Luzu nodded and said, oh, I remember you. Is there something you need? I have quite a lot going on here. Xiafan knocked on the security grill and demanded, you remembered me. So why haven't you opened the door? Looking confused, Luzu opened the door, and Xiafan pushed her motorbike in. You have such a big courtyard. I've always thought of it as my ideal playground since young. Every time I pass by your house, I take a peep at it, but I never expected to see you here. What were you doing in the courtyard? Luzu put away his tools and said, nothing, I was just tidying up. Since you're here, come in and have a drink. Xiafan was wearing a pair of tight-fitting jeans and a large vest. Through the armholes, one could see her bra. Her outfit was sexy and daring. Luzu did not expected the little girl to have grown up to be so sexy. Suddenly, he felt old. My family moved to the development nearby. From the street outside your house, you can make a detour to the back of the development. I just came back from Carrefour, and did not expect to see you in the courtyard. Xiafan rattled on. Luzu placed 2 bottles of drinks and some snacks on the table. Time flies. How is Xian? Is she married? Xiafan looked dubiously at Luzu and said, why? You still can't get over your old flame? Are you trying to back to her? Luzu shook his head and smiled. It has been a few years, and the memories have faded. I asked only because we are still friends, and you happen to be here. Xiafan immediately replied, my sister is studying in the United Kingdom. You won't be able to see her at the moment. Why are you back? I heard that you were doing pretty well in Beijing. Luzu tried to avoid the question and asked, how did you know that I was doing pretty well? I was just an employee. Xiafan narrowed her eyes and said, isn't everyone an employee? Don't tell me you want to be a boss. Xiafan stayed in Luzu's house for quite a while, leaving satisfied after finishing up a big packet of walnuts. Luzu suddenly felt that the air had become fresher with Xiafan's presence. Luzu let the ants into the painting space, but all of them died in an instant. This was not due to the environment. Those were natural deaths. He slapped his head and felt like a fool. Although the lifespan of a worker ant could reach 6 to 7 years, it would be dramatically reduced if the worker ant left its colony and lived without its queen. Furthermore, time moved 10,000 times faster in the painting space. These worker ants could only live for a few seconds. It was not possible to form a colony. Luzu immediately turned to the internet. Hardly any of the items that he needed could be bought over the internet, so he searched through the agricultural cultivation forums, found some people that worked in the related fields, and ordered from them after some discussion. 2 days later, Luzu received his package. It was a special jar with lots of intersecting tunnels, where ants crawled around, and at the bottom of the jar was the queen ant. It was an ants culturing jar. Luzu opened the jar and let the queen ant into the painting space. The plants bloomed, and colorful trees and shrubs filled the area. The trees seemed to have shrunk, which could be due to the gravity and other environmental factors. It was a pity that there was no sign of any animals. With enough time, Luzu believed that the painting space might be able to generate its own 2-dimensional animals. However, Time was not on his side. Lucy buried the ants jar shallowly in the soil of a hillside and started making observations. He saw that under the accelerated time, the ants had started to spread out, filling up the hill. The days and nights came and went, making one feel as though they were watching a fast-forwarded documentary movie. In less than 2 hours, 2 to 3 years had passed in the painting space and a new generation of the ants had replaced the original ones. It looked like the ants formed a unique civilization. They had precise and detailed segregation of duties. Just like human beings, each of them was like a screw that could not be removed from a machine. Should any ant leave the colony, it would not survive. Ants are amazing creatures. 4 seasons had come and gone, and time passed by quickly. After a day, the original queen ant died, and new queen ants took over. However, there seemed to be 2 different colonies under 2 queens. Lucy also found that the 2 colonies took different evolutionary paths. One colony went down into the ground while the other had wings and built their nests on the mountain peak. Lucy named them ground ants and flying ants. On the 4th day, there was a huge transformation in the 2 colonies. Originally, there were the worker ants, soldier ants, male ants, and queen ants, but gradually, there was a further breakdown of their roles. The flying ants occupied the sky and took on a different form. If Lucy had not been observing them, he would not have known that they were of the same origin. The flying ants evolved into a species similar to bees. The color of the ground ants faded, turning golden, and then they went deeper into the ground. With this evolution, the 2 colonies split up further. The different colonies gradually spread out to the entire island. On the 6th day, some ants started to move close to the sea. The limbs of those ants started to become vestigial, and the ants evolved into a species that was able to survive in the water. The painting space was flourishing and diversifying. It amazed Lucy that a small colony of ants was able to produce such a large variety of strange lives. "Let's go out, relax, and have a drink." Lucy had been dragged out by Sci-fi to join her friends for dinner. After dinner, they went for a karaoke session and had beer and liquor. At first, Lucy had felt embarrassed to be with the high school students, but he soon realized that there were also university graduates and adults there. Many of them were couples. Lucy was shocked to find that modern high school students were much more open-minded than his generation. After drinking a bit, a pretty and innocent-looking young lady started to make out with her university boyfriend. After a while, they excused themselves to the restroom and disappeared. The rest of the group started to get even wilder, especially Sci-fi. She sang and screamed. She also kept kissing Lucy's neck with breath filled with the smell of liquor, which terrified Lucy and made him quite uneasy. As Lucy supported the stumbling Sci-fi, he could feel the stares of the people on the street. He had not kidnapped this girl, nor did he have any intention of taking advantage of the drunk. Although Lucy knew he did not do anything wrong, when he saw the police at the intersection, he could not help but stopped walking as if he was guilty. He then waited a bit further up the hill, some distance away, for the taxi. While in the taxi, he was scrutinized by the taxi driver. When they were finally near Sci-fi's house, Lucy gave Sci-fi a tug and said, "Wake up, wake up." Sci-fi opened her eyes and asked, "Why?" Lucy remembered that Sci-fi lived in the development to the left of his house. "We're back. I'll see you home." Sci-fi pulled Lucy's collar and said, "No, I can't go back. If I go back in this state, I'll get scolded." Lucy replied, "If you don't go home, your parents will be worried." Sci-fi immediately replied, "It is all right. I am in boarding school and only go home every few days. My parents won't know that I'm not staying at school today. Your house is big, isn't it?" With groggy eyes, Sci-fi looked at Lucy and said, "Will you try anything funny with me, the sister of your first love?" Lucy pinched Sci-fi's 2 cheeks and pulled them in opposite direction. He said, "Stop your nonsense. You are not even developed yet." Lucy looked at her sexy body. She was wearing a mini skirt and stockings, and her white halter top showed off her cleavage. Her style of dress was very bold. Sci-fi caught Luzu looking at her and she straightened up. She squeezed her slender arms together in front of her body and said, "They're big, aren't they?" Luzu was speechless. There were 2 bathrooms in his 2-story house, so they each took one. After taking her shower, Luzu took out a clean blanket and tidied the room. He then realized that Sci-fi was still in the other bathroom. "Hey, say something. Have you been flushed away?" he called out. Sci-fi had a towel wrapped around her as she walked out. "Wow. It is nice to have a bathtub. It is so relaxing," she said, smiling. Luzu shook his head and said, "I am not used to using that." He brought Sci-fi to the room that had been prepared for her and said, "You will sleep here tonight. The blanket and sheets are." The following morning, Luzu carefully climbed out of bed and saw Sci-fi as she walked out of her room. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair and said, "Good morning." Sci-fi took out a set of clean clothes from her bag. After cleaning herself up and putting on her clothes, she left for school. Before leaving, she kissed Luzu and said, "Thank you." Luzu looked blankly at Sci-fi as she opened the door of the courtyard. Before she left, she turned to smile at him, leaving him in a daze. After Luzu returned to his study, he spread out the scroll of the world, and looked at the scene in the painting space. It was winter with heavy snow and the sea had become frozen. There were now new and strange creatures under the sea. This was a world completely formed by many different kinds of insects. Some occupied the sky, while others occupied the forest, the ground, and the sea. They were all over the place. The queen ant was an amazing being. With her pheromones, she could change the genes of the younger generation, and thereby control the entire ant colony. Such ability made her a godlike being within her colony. As the number of the colonies increased, space became limited and food also became insufficient, thus the environment became unsustainable. The colonies fought continuously, and each day their colonies were wiped out and some queen ants were dragged out and killed. However, today was very different. Luzu realized that a group of insects kept crawling out from a strange-looking nest on a small hill in the painting space. There were many different kinds of them. Some flew in the sky, some swam in the water, and some went underground. These were not born by the queen ant, but were produced using the nest. Luzu felt that this was very strange. It seemed like that colony had evolved and developed intelligence and it tried to take control over its direction of evolution. Luzu found the situation abnormal, so he turned to the internet. He found a similar species, which was known as the Zerg in StarCraft. As Luzu looked at the painting space, he became puzzled. Have they evolved? Who is controlling the insects? Is it the queen? Where did the intelligence come from? Is the queen the only one with intelligence or is each insect now has its own intelligence? Luzu activated his power and the silver sigil started to glitter. He immersed himself into the painting space and focused on this special group of insects. Luzu found that his consciousness seemed to have separated from his body. He felt he had spent one whole day in the painting space, but in the outside world, only a few seconds had passed. Luzu saw a long, thin queen insect, with a huge head and 4 long limbs. The tail was long and a black exoskeleton covered its entire body. The queen insect had spared itself from being a machine of reproduction and possessed intelligence entirely of its own. From his godlike perspective, Luzu saw that the queen insect constantly sent her thoughts to the other insects, so that she could instruct them to attack the other insects, produce, conquer, combat, and self-supply. The world belongs to us. Luzu could feel the ambition of the queen insect. However, he was even more surprised to find out that she could sense and control all of the other insects from her colony. What power is that? Is it mind power? Or willpower? After observing the queen insect for a while, he started to see the silver light emanating from her brain, and he started to see her thoughts. The queen's mind was able to channel to a special dimensional space. Luzu immediately dove into it and he felt his consciousness was alienated from the painting space. It had been compressed into a line. Luzu followed this line to get to its end, and he felt his consciousness was swimming forward. Finally, He passed through an endless source of information before entering into a world that was filled with light. Luzu felt as if he would be assimilated by this silver light. With his entire consciousness becoming corroded and tainted, he was afraid that he might completely lose his own consciousness if he stayed any longer. Struggling, he tried to get out of this strange place, and after a long while, he finally returned to his body. Utterly exhausted, Luzu finally fell into a deep sleep. Luzu slept for a day and a night. When he woke up the following day, he felt that the whole world had changed. He had become more sensitive to his surroundings. When he tried to reach out for his disposable cup by the side of the bed, the cup fell to the floor, before he could touch it. When he looked at the scroll of the world, he found that the battle inside the scroll was growing more and more fierce. After the first queen insect had appeared, the rest of the colonies had started to evolve as well. Fights, evolutions, and new insects developed as a result of the catalyst. Although Luzu would have liked to continue with his observation, he changed his mind when he realized he was starving. After walking around his neighborhood, he settled down at a cafe across the street from Carrefour. It was late in the afternoon and quite a number of people were having afternoon tea. "Sir, are you alone or?" the waitress asked him, immediately struck by his handsome appearance. "This guy is quite good looking, but he does not look wealthy." "Oh, it is such a tiring day." "Ah." Luzu looked at the waitress, stunned. Why did she say such a thing in front of me? Why is he looking at me? Don't tell me that he likes me. The waitress was thinking in her head. I am alone. I want a set of. Luzu looked at the menu and ordered his meal. After the waitress had written down his order, she turned and left. Luzu looked at her back and was baffled. He did not remember seeing her talking, as she did not move her lips. However, he had heard some strange sound, as if the waitress was talking. Another cute waitress in uniform arrived, bringing his meal, thinking of her own life's dilemma. How I wish I could knock off from work now. Zhuhao has asked me out for a movie. Should I go? Don't go. When a guy asks a girl out for a midnight movie, they usually have an ulterior motive. They would have planned it well in advance, and are waiting for you to take the bait, Luzu said. The waitress immediately looked up, stared at Luzu and asked, "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say that out loud?" The waitress was flustered and quickly walked away. As she was walking away, she turned to look at Luzu with a strange and confused expression. Luzu lowered his head and ate his food. He was smiling. Finally, he could no longer contain his joy and burst into laughter. Mind reading? It is mind reading. I know what others are thinking. This is amazing. Luzu recalled what had happened to him. When he was in the low-dimensional world, his consciousness had gone into an inner space and absorbed strange energy that allowed him to have such power. He was like the queen insect, which was able to control the entire colony through its mind power. However, Luzu had just acquired this power, so it was inferior compared to the queen insects. He could only hear the thoughts of the people around him. On his way home, he passed many people who had just left work. As he passed by the people, he could hear different voices. I haven't finished the report. I must get it done tonight. School should have ended. I wonder if my honey has gone to pick up La. My boss is too much. I need to fly again tomorrow. I have been traveling for more than half of this month. I need to send allowance to mom and dad tomorrow. How much shall I send? I think I will send more. Luzu heard many voices in his brain. There seemed to be a buzzing sound in his head, as if his brain was exploding. After getting out of the crowd, he felt better, and was now walking along the small path toward his house. It's really mind reading. Its effective distance is limited, no further than 2 meters. However, this power will be a problem, if I can't to shut it off. Luzu was extremely excited to have acquired a special power. As he thought of how the queen insect had evolved and created offsprings with diverse morphology through its pheromone secretion, he wondered if he could do the same. His cancer might possibly be cured because of this. That's right. Who knows? I might be cured. Luzu became very excited. Although he had accepted the fact that he had a terminal disease, It would be great if he need not die from it. For the next few days, Luza continued to observe the happenings in the scroll of the world. He realized that the scroll was an entrance of a low-dimensional space. His painting space used to be a two-dimensional world, but ever since he introduced the elements and concept from the three-dimensional world, the dimensions of the painting space may have been increased. However, it hadn't reached three-dimension yet, but was in between two-dimensional and three-dimensional. This made the painting space unique and unpredictable. When Luzu entered the painting space with his consciousness, the long tunnel that he saw must be in one-dimensional space. The two-dimensional space was a flat surface, and one-dimensional world at most could be just a line. In this case, it would be even more difficult for living things to survive in an one-dimensional world than in a two-dimensional space. Such space may not even be able to contain basic elements. Luzu guessed that the inner space should be a zero-dimensional space, a highly condensed singularity. In this world, there could be nothing except the source of power. No material things, but the source, the existence of a concept. If in a two-dimensional world, life could barely survive in the flat surface, then how about in the one-dimensional world? Or even zero-dimensional? In such low-dimensional spaces, the only thing that could exist probably were some conceptual things such as the consciousness or soul. There was a tunnel leading toward the low-dimensional spaces in the scroll of the world. As the dimensional space reduced, the life forms found it became closer to their origin. Life in the zero-dimensional space could be counted as being the source. Life forms existed in the form of consciousness, or soul. Both Luzu and the queen insect had gained access to the low-dimensional space through the scroll of the world. Through absorbing energy from the source of power, they had strengthened their consciousness and eventually developed something like mind power. The living things in the higher dimensional space were more complex and thus were farther away from getting in contact with the origin of life. Lives below the two-dimensional space made use of the source energy and activate their souls. Luzu named this power the source form. He started to imitate the queen insect, making use of the tunnel to bring his consciousness into the zero-dimensional space through the scroll of the world and to absorb the source form to further increase his consciousness and mind power. However, his consciousness could not last long in the zero-dimensional world. After absorbing a small amount of source form, he had to get out quickly. Later, he was able to maintain the structure of his consciousness in the zero-dimensional world through meditation and visualization. This helped him alter the situation slightly. Luzu started to read up on meditation, Taoism, visualization, and cultivation, hoping to gain something useful from these subjects. Hello, teacher. I am here for the yoga class. Mr. Lu, I am your instructor. From now on, please put aside 2 hours each day for yoga practice. Since you have never done yoga before, we will start with the basics. Kaijia was a 25-year-old yoga instructor. She had her long hair twisted up into a bun and she exuded an air of classic elegance. Luzu had signed up for a VIP package, which included personal yoga training sessions. He came to learn about meditation, and had never expected to meet such a beauty. Luzu had a crush on Kaijia, but he had certainly paid a high fee for it. Luzu felt that, when he was practicing meditation, he could feel his blood circulating. On top of that, he could gradually sense every part of his body. He realized that he was able to focus and control his mind power as time passed by. Originally, he could only send his mind power toward the outside world. As he strengthened it, he was also able to conceal the power. That was his reason for taking up yoga meditation, as it could help him control and sense things better. Not many people were able to grasp the essence of meditation, and it was after much research that he had found this class. Ever since he had started to meditate, Luzu became able to discern the thoughts of others when he wanted. After he released his mind power, he could still sense the brainwaves of others. This was mind reading. Take the instructor, for example. Luzu knew that she had just broken up with her boyfriend. Although she was smiling, her mind was in turmoil and she was not concentrating. Luzu followed Kaijiajia's instructions and began to move through the postures. He felt that yoga and qigong were similar. Both were good for blood circulation and enhanced the senses of one's body. This was exactly what Luzu was looking for. He took up yoga, not because he wanted to improve his health, but because he was hoping to gain insights into his body through meditation. After following Kaijiajia's instruction and going through the postures, Luzu was able to sense a bit of what he was looking for. Entering meditation through postures seemed to make it easier for Luzu to observe the status of his own body. The 2-hour class quickly came to the end, and Luzu noticed that it was almost night time. "Coach, you look troubled. What is bothering you?" Luzu asked, as he stood up and relaxed his body. Kaijiajia was shocked and asked, "Oh? It is so obvious. I'm so sorry." Luzu quickly replied, "It's alright. But, if you are troubled, it might be better for you to go out and take a walk. If you keep it and all bottled up, it will be worse for you." Kaijiajia smiled and said, "Thank you, I'll keep that in mind." Luzu looked out of the window and saw that it was getting dark. "Is it time for you to finish work? Shall we have dinner together? I would like to treat you to a meal to show my appreciation. I will need plenty of your help in the future." Is he interested in me? Although he is quite good looking, he is not really my cup of tea. Moreover, he is too direct. And I do not want to eat unhealthy food. As Kaijiajia was about to reject him, Luzu quickly asked, "Am I being too blunt? I know of a restaurant that does organic vegetarian food. The style and ambience are also quite nice. This place came to mind since you are not in a good mood. It might do you good to have a change of environment. What do you think?" Upon hearing this, Kaijiajia became interested and said, "Alright. Why don't you wait for me downstairs? I can leave in 20 minutes. Luzu nodded and said, "I will wait for you downstairs." The two of them had an enjoyable dinner together. As Luzu had expected, Kaijiajia liked the style and food of the restaurant. During their conversation, Luzu found out what interested her and made her laugh. Her unhappiness and dazedness from earlier in the day completely disappeared as she laughed. "Let me tell you, when I was in college back then, I did something stupid exactly like that." "Really? Really?" "Back then, I was with A." Throughout the night, Luzu was humorous, confident, and a bit artistic. He was good looking as well. Suddenly, Kaijiajia felt that Luzu knew her very well. Never had she enjoyed talking to someone so much. She felt that it was even fine for her to pour her heart out to him. When they left the restaurant, they were already very comfortable with each other. They were chatting and laughing. Luzu drove her home. As Luzu was about to leave, she suddenly turned back to ask him, "Would you like to come to my house?" Luzu was taken aback. He was only trying to build a good relationship with her, so he had not expected things to move so quickly. He knew that Kaijiajia felt empty after her broken relationship and needed someone to lean on. He had come at the right time to capture her heart. Luzu did not want to miss this opportunity. "I am actually quite curious. What kind of person is a goddess like you like in real life?" "Oh no, I think I am having some regrets now. A woman should not let a man know her personal life." Kaijiajia lived in a relatively large place compared to the rest in her development. She had probably lived here with her boyfriend previously. Her place was classic European style, and the furniture had been carefully chosen. One could tell that Kaijiajia was very particular about the way she lived. What happened after that came naturally. Both of them cuddled together and rolled onto the bed. This was different from the times Ifan was drunk and Luzu had to take her home. This time around, Luzu felt very strongly toward his partner. Especially since Kaijiajia practiced yoga and had an athletic figure. She was like a leopardess, leaving him wanting more. After leaving Kaijiajia's place the following morning, Luzu felt that he was despicable. He had used mind reading to go after girls. It was similar to cheating in an examination. This was truly a powerful weapon. After getting into the car, Luzu looked at the rear view mirror and tidied his hair, then saw a love bite on his neck. Kaijiajia was wilder in bed than she was in real life. Luzu quickly buttoned up to cover the mark. At this moment, his mobile phone rang. Luzu looked at his phone and saw that it was a message from Kaijia, which read, "I love being with you." Luzu shrugged his shoulders. She was happy, he was happy. They had both gotten what they wanted. After all, one should not make the relationship between men and women too complicated. Only youngsters would pledge their undying love for each other and be madly in love. Both of them had passed such an age. He remembered what Xiafan said. Enjoy life when you can. If you wait until the end of your time to figure out what was missed, you wouldn't have any opportunity to make it up to yourself. Thump. Thump. Luzu could hear his own heartbeat. He mentally ran through his whole body. He could feel his blood circulating, and the senses that seemed vague previously had now become clearer. Ultimately, a strange-looking picture appeared in front of his eyes. There were no colors, only structures in this picture. It was like a three-dimensional model or a planar graph created using CAD. The skin, muscles, bones, arteries and internal organs were all shown in the picture, formed by multiple subunits. Luzu could even feel the thickness of his skin, the length of his bones, and the sizes of his internal organs. However, as his mind power was not powerful enough, he was still unable to reach the cellular level. He could only vaguely sense it. Luzu could see the dark shadow in his lungs. The cancer cells, which had been separated from the healthy cells, had been increasing. Amassing, they had started to form a tumor. I have succeeded. The moment that Luzu became excited, he found himself coming out from the godlike perspective, and was no longer able to maintain stable meditation or calm state of mind. Instead, he immediately went to his study table, which was filled with medical and cancer-related books. Luzu was prepared for his experiments. He had read up on a number of books, and ever since he had awakened his mind power, he felt that he was smarter and more wired to learn. Previously, he had to read through things a few times in order to comprehend what was written, but now he just had to scan through it once, and he was able to remember and understand it. When the body experiences a long period of suboptimal health conditions, the cells start to resist the body, and that is what causes cancer. It was not a pathogen. Previously, Luzu had given up hope on beating his cancer, but after understanding it, he realized that it was not as terrifying as he had first thought. As cancer cells were not considered a pathogen, the body's immune system would not kill these cancer cells. Men contracted cancer not because they were infected by a pathogen, but because the body was in a state of perpetual decay. As such, when one became unhealthy, some of the cells began to resist the body, in a sort of mutiny. Should the condition persist, the rebellious army would expand, form a tumor, and gradually spread through the body. Therefore, killing the cancer cells would not solve the root of the problem. If the problems of the body have not been resolved, one would develop cancer again. When the body becomes healthier and the person's state of mind gets better, his cancer would then be under control. In fact, there were a number of cases, whereby cancer was cured on its own. In light of this knowledge, Luzu had decided to make adjustments to his body's condition. After which, he would urge his body to destroy the cancer cells from within in order to treat his lung cancer. From what Luzu knew, this method should be feasible. For the next few days, Luzu read a great deal of medical-related books. He even got a copy of the class schedule of the medical faculty in Jiangcheng University and sat in the classes for the topics that he was interested in. During his free time, he would go on dates with Kaijia. After coming up with a plan, Luzu started to carry out this plan to heal his body. Different glands release different hormones. The 8 glands in the human body controlled the growth, development, metabolism, and puberty of the body through the hormones they secreted. He figured that, as long as he could control his glands, he would be able to control his body, height, size, shape, strength, stamina, sexuality, intelligence, and much more. Luzu had decided to stimulate the glands in his body in order to produce hormones that could control his development and health. He wanted to adjust his hormonal system to improve his health, which was suboptimal due to work and other environmental factors, to that of a professional athlete. Through these adjustments, he hoped to get rid of the cancer cells and cure his disease. Through his mental strength, Luza first stimulated and controlled the secretion of the growth hormone from the pituitary gland. This would stimulate his development again. After which, he stimulated his adrenal, pancreas, and thyroid glands in order to secrete a reasonable amount of hormones to adjust his body to a perfect condition. Naturally, he had stimulated his sex gland as well. He tested out the list according to his plan. After he exited the introspect status, he recorded the data and changes that had taken place after he examined his body. Although he could see the changes inside his body, he could not feel anything yet. It was as if nothing had happened. In the next few days, Luza felt a tremendous change in his body. His body ached all over. This indicated that his body was redeveloping. His bones were growing again. Previously, he would cough when it was cold at night, but this condition had improved. Furthermore, although he did not train, he was building up muscle. Through research, Luza knew how each gland affected the different parts of his body. Through the stimulation of each particular gland, he would also gradually adjust his body's condition. This adjustment would take a long period of time, since he had to take it slowly, just in case it backfired. Initially, Luza felt numb, even when he was walking. He ached all over and felt extremely itchy. For a number of days, he laid on his bed and sofa, not feeling like moving. He also had an increase in appetite. When Luza gradually adjusted the level of the secretion of the hormones, these conditions became milder. Luza realized that, during this period of 2 weeks, he had grown taller. And, where there used to be blemishes on his skin had now become soft and fair, like a baby's. His muscles had also become more defined. Although Luza did not work out, he felt as though he had been exercising every day. His muscles had been stimulated and were growing healthily. Most importantly, Luza realized that the dark shadow in his body had started to fade. A large amount of cancer cells in his lungs had already died off, having then been released through his excretory system. He was no longer coughing either. As he stood before the mirror with his shorts on, Luza barely recognized himself. He saw a tall and handsome man in the reflection. His body was proportioned with golden ratio, with well-defined muscles. His face had softened and he had clear-cut feature. His eyes looked bright and full of energy. He looked like a celebrity or model. He had become better looking than all of those celebrities, even compared to their photoshopped images. Luza had not looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He was surprised to see such a great change. It explained why Kaijia had told him that he had changed a lot, when he went to his yoga class the day before. Is this really me? Luza stood in front of the mirror, wondering, with his jaw hanging open. Over the past 2 weeks, other than attending the personal yoga classes and going to Kaijia's house, Luza had been mostly staying at home. Today, while he was out, he found something amiss. Everyone who walked past him turned around to stare at him. There were even a few times when he actually caught sight of people secretly taking photographs of him. He looks so handsome. Is he some comic character? Is he a celebrity? He is so elegant. He seems to have a mixed ethnicity. He looks so gorgeous. His eyes are so charming. Oh no! I have been love-struck. He's looking at me. Along the way, weird thoughts flooded Luza's mind continuously. When Luza looked at himself in the mirror, he only felt that he looked good and was not really bothered. However, when others looked at him, it seemed that Luza had undergone an astonishing change. For instance, when he went to the cafe for a meal, the waitress actually secretly passed him her mobile number, and many girls came up with different excuses to get his contact information. Luza found this all very puzzling. Even if he was handsome, he should not be receiving so much attention. After he finished his meal with Kaijia, she glanced at the seat on the left. Luza immediately asked, "What's wrong?" Kaijia pouted and said, "That girl keeps peeking at you. You are very charming, aren't you? Recently, you have changed a lot. Because I am always with you, I don't feel anything. But you seem different from the first time I saw you. You look too stunning now." Luza immediately teased her, Have I become more good-looking? Kaijia touched her red lips and said, you could say that, but it is more than that. You exude a charm, no, a scent. It smells good and is so captivating. Luzu was taken aback. A scent? He quickly sniffed himself and said, I don't smell anything. Kaijia laughed at once and said, only women can smell it. It's the manly scent, the smell of hormones. Luzu lost control of himself and burst into laughter. However, he remembered what Kaijia had said. Have I adjusted my body into a perfect state, whereby it exudes a special scent that has caused this scenario? After dinner, Luzu naturally went to Kaijia's house. He took out a bottle of red wine from his car, and after enjoying 2 glasses or so, their desires were quickly ignited. After everything, Kaijia was still in a daze and took quite a while to recover. Then, she looked at Luzu and said, I nearly died just now. Luzu quickly said, I will take note next time. You frightened me just now. Kaijia shook her head. The feeling is great. Luzu, you are the most perfect man that I have ever met. Kaijia lay in his arms and scratched his chest like a kitten. After a while, she said, Luzu, let's end our relationship. What? Luzu could not understand what had just happened. They were having a good time in bed earlier, but things suddenly changed. Just as Luzu was about to use his mind power to explore Kaijia's thoughts, she opened her mouth. My boyfriend is back. He has looked me up and talked to me for a long while. He wants me to go back to him. Kaijia stared at Luzu, looking confused. She seemed to have made a tough decision. Luzu cuddled Kaijia and asked, why? Is he better than me? Kaijia shook her head and said, he is not as good looking or charming as you. You are much better than him in all aspects. But he loves me. Luzu immediately asked, do I not love you? Kaijia forced a smile and asked, did you love me? Luzu was dumbfounded. After a while, he slowly stood up and put on his clothes. He bent down and kissed Kaijia on her forehead. I'm sorry. I truly enjoy the time that I have spent with you. I will not interfere with your life anymore. Also, I wish you and your boyfriend all the best. Kaijia looked affectionately at Luzu. She could not bear to part with him, but Luzu could tell that she was resolute with her decision. While he was in the car, Luzu felt a bit lost. He felt that he was somewhat despicable. Nevertheless, this had ended quite well as his relationship with Kaijia had come to a close. Moreover, his cancer had been cured and he now had a perfect body. After having gone through so much, Luzu felt deeply that he should do something that he liked. He should live for his interests and hobbies, and not live like a dog, like how he used to. By the time he reached home, it was already midnight. He parked his car and was about to open the door when he saw someone squatting outside, scaring him out of his wits. Luzu slowly walked up and realized that the person looked familiar. It was a girl who was squatting with her head low, just like an ostrich. He pushed her shoulder and called out softly, Sci-fi? Sci-fi lifted up her head and looked at Luzu, tears filling her eyes. In a hoarse voice, she cried out, Luzu, where have you been? Why are you not home at such a late hour? Luzu curled his lips and said, who would know that you would be squatting outside my house in the middle of the night? Come in, it's windy outside. After taking a hot shower, Sci-fi walked out of the bathroom and carelessly wrapped herself up in a towel. Her hair was still wet as she sat down on the sofa. Luzu asked, what happened to you? Why did you not dry your hair? Sci-fi lowered her head, not saying a word. As Luzu dried her hair with a towel, Sci-fi cried out, I have broken up with my boyfriend. Okay. Sci-fi was extremely dissatisfied. Right away, she lifted up her head and said, can you be a bit sympathetic? I have broken up with my boyfriend. Can you not comfort me? You are. Sci-fi did not finish her sentence, but instead looked at Luzu with her jaw dropped. Who are you? She gasped. Luzu took out a hairdryer and plugged it into the electric socket. He then said nonchalantly, who else? Clearly I'm Luzu. Sci-fi shook her head continuously and said, "Impossible. The Luzu I know is not so good looking. Tell me honestly, are you a monster? Here is the hairdryer. After you have dried your hair, go to the room that you went the other time, and have an early night." Luzu was lying on his bed, playing with his mobile phone when Sci-fi suddenly approached him. Staring at his face carefully, she asked, "Why did I not realize earlier that you were so handsome? You were good looking before, but now you are stunning. Tell me honestly, did you have plastic surgery?" Luzu pushed away Sci-fi's head, which was almost touching his face. "Previously, my work environment has greatly affected my health. Now, I am recovering and I have been training every day, so that may explain it. It's such an amazing transformation." Sci-fi was simple-minded, so she believed what Luzu told her. However, because of Luzu's flawless appearance, she still stayed beside him. "Hey, Luzu, I have just broken up." "Oh. Should you not comfort me? Should I? I don't think so." Luzu put down his mobile phone and glanced at Sci-fi, feeling somewhat strange. Ever since he was able to control his mind power, he did not really read another person's thoughts unless it was absolutely necessary, because he felt that it was quite meaningless. "Wait. Are you asking me to be your backup?" he asked. Sci-fi sat up and yelled, "Hey! What do you mean by that? I'm very popular and have many suitors in school." She then looked at Luzu and her look changed slightly. "I have never thought about it in the past, but now. If you are willing, I can consider letting you take advantage of the situation so that you can be my boyfriend." Sci-fi was only wrapped up in towel at the moment, so there were hidden meanings when she used the words take advantage. However, Luzu immediately rejected her righteously, after which he chased Sci-fi out of his room and locked the door. The high school students nowadays were really crazy. Luzu felt that if he had allowed her to stay in his room any longer, his only bottom line would collapse. The following morning, before Sci-fi left, she still pestered Luzu. Because of her, Luzu spent over 10 minutes just to brush his teeth. Even his body almost broke down from her consistent shaking. "Promise me. It will be embarrassing for me not to have a boyfriend at my birthday party next month." Luzu finally snapped and asked, "What is there to be embarrassed about? At your age, it is only normal not to have a boyfriend. If you were my daughter, I would have spanked you." Sci-fi replied scornfully, "You are so old-fashioned. Which century are you living in?" In the end, because Luzu had more pressing issues to attend to and could not afford to waste more time with Sci-fi, he still agreed to her request, but he would only go as a normal friend. He was determined to not fall for her tricks. Sci-fi was elated and even took out her mobile phone. After taking a few photos of Luzu, she left proudly. Luzu went to the hospital and felt that he had received special treatment there. From the moment he reached the hospital and queued up, many people were already staring at him. Many of the nurses even seemed to have received news that he was here. Standing in the distance, they looked at him, oohing and ahhing. "Wow, he really is so good looking. I thought it's a lie. He is so elegant and polished, and has a great body too." Luzu felt that his illness had already fully recovered, but he was afraid that he might be wrong. Hence, he had decided to get a full physical examination in the hospital to see if he had really recovered or had any other problems. When he took tests on the eyes, blood, and blood pressure, as well as an electrocardiogram, it all went quite normal. However, when a female physician was checking on him, she touched him all over, causing him to feel very awkward. "Take off your clothes. Take everything off." Luzu looked at the female physician who had glasses on and dropped his jaw. The female physician looked sternly at Luzu and said, "What are you waiting for? Quickly, take your clothes off." Just as Luzu was hesitating about whether to take off everything, the female physician finally added, "But leave your undergarments on." After checking him, the female physician said, "Your body is fine. You are very healthy indeed. The results of the blood and urine tests will be back in a few days. We will inform you when the report is ready." Luzu nodded and heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed like there was indeed nothing wrong with his body anymore. Even the minor lung illnesses he had were absent at the moment, which caused him to be very excited. Before leaving, the female physician suddenly passed him her business card and said, "In the future, if you feel unwell, you can call me at this number. I can come to your house and check on you." Taking the business card, Luza was flabbergasted. Do doctors in hospitals now provide such services? He glanced at the card and realized that the doctor's name was Li Wei. Seeing the way Luza was bending forward, Li Wei suddenly put her hand into his t-shirt and pressed on his spine. After hearing a cracking sound, Luza immediately felt an awesome sensation rush up to his head. "You should straighten your back. Don't keep bending forward like that, or else you will look weak. Besides, it is not good for your health." This was a bad habit of Luza, the result of him sitting in front of the computer for so many years. In this modern society, this was also a common problem. However, Luza felt that Dr. Li Wei was behaving in an unusual way towards him. At once, he sensed her thoughts. Luza thanked Li Wei with a smile and quickly walked out from the door. As he stood at the door, he wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. Ever since he was able to read the minds of others, he realized that everyone projected outwardly much differently from what they actually were thinking. Most were, in reality, very wild inside. When Luza returned home, he heaved a sigh of relief. Cancer and death had been hanging over his head like a shadow, but now he could finally stop worrying about them and be at ease. He took out the scroll of the world. Just as he opened it, he realized that the measure of the silver sigil in his mind rose suddenly. Luza knew that the measure represented the amount of the source form. Previously, Luza had used a huge amount of source form to change the rules and regulations of the painting space. He had basically completely drained the source form. After that, there had been no changes to it, but the measure had just suddenly increased. He knew that there must be a reason for this. Although Luza could not directly use the source form from the sigil to enhance his mind power and spirit, he could make use of the source form to change the rules of the painting space. This was extremely important to him, because with sufficient source form, he could change the painting space at his will, just like a true god. Luza entered the painting space and immediately discovered that the very first queen insect had died. It was jointly attacked by a few other queen insects that appeared later on, dragged out from its nest, and died a horrible death. It was precisely at the moment the queen insect died that the measure of the source form in Luza's brain increased. Luza then brought his consciousness into the painting space and gradually discovered that the source form's increase did not only occur when the queen insect died. In fact, every time a living thing died, the measure of the source form would increase subtly. He did notice that there was a great difference between an ordinary insect and a queen insect. As the changes were minimal for ordinary insects, Luza had not noticed the difference before. It was only when the queen insect died, and the measure shot up, that this great difference caught his attention. The entire space in the painting became the playground of the insects. These insects were extremely different from the ants that Luza had placed in it earlier. In fact, various very strange-looking insects, which had never existed before in the real world, popped up continuously. Moreover, they were seen everywhere, in the sky, on land, and in the sea. Among them, there were dozens of queen insects which possessed intelligence and mind powers. The development of the insects was way beyond Luza's imagination. The internal structure of the different insect colonies kept developing. At the beginning, the different insect worker types were around a dozen, but then it evolved into hundreds or even thousands of worker types. In addition, these insects were getting increasingly intelligent as well. They started to communicate, cooperate, conquer, develop, research, and create different weapons. Luza felt that they could even be called the civilization of the insects. Luza saw the insects that were flying in the sky like airships throw acid into a few nests, immediately setting them ablaze. There were beetles that looked like armored vehicles firing missiles into the sky. The battle and collaboration among the insects were actually very modernized. Luza found this all very scary. If not for the confined space and restrictions of the painting space, the insects would have come into the world of mankind. If this happened, it would absolutely destruct humanity. The lifespan of a queen ant was around 20 years in the painting space, but in real life, it was less than a day. However, from the birth of the first queen insect to the current moment, 27 days had passed, which meant that this queen insect had lived around 700 years. What's more, it did not die a natural death, it was killed by its enemy. Luza found this amazing, wondering how the queen insect could live for so long. Luza took out his notebook once again and recorded down the information of these queen insects. As he did so, he realized that when the mind powers of the queen insects had reached a certain level, their mind powers started to get more refined and made it possible for the queen insects to observe and control their own genes. These queen insects had actually been modifying and developing their own genes. These insects were way ahead of mankind, at least in terms of genetic development. If the strength is equivalent to one source form unit, SFU, when my mind power was initially awakened, after practicing medication for such a long while, my mind power should have reached 6 SFU. It probably needs 7 SFU in order to break through the bottleneck, and reach the point where I am able to freely control the power and therefore influence the external world just like the queen insects. Luzu estimated that, if he gave it his all, he would be able to break through in 5 days. He was excited to think about experiencing what it felt like to have a mind power that would allow him to observe his genes. Other than taking medical classes, Luzu also got the curriculums of the Department of Biology of Jiangxing University, and went to the classes daily. In addition, he bought some books on biology to increase his competency in this area. As he was auditing the classes only, Luza did not disturb the lecturer or the other students. He sat quietly at the back of the classroom, trying to remain incognito. However, he still could not stop the girls from swarming around him. Luza did enjoy the special treatment, though, as he had never had anything like it during his previous college years. In fact, from the moment he had stepped into the classroom, all eyes were fixed on him. Many girls screamed with excitement, but the guys only looked at him with animosity. This made Luza feel embarrassed. "Hi, are you a biology student? Why is it that I have never seen you before?" The moment Luza sat down and turned to the page that he had bookmarked previously, a few girls gathered, surrounding him and bombarding him with questions. They were pretty and all seemed quite confident, otherwise, they would not have come over to chat him up. "No, I'm only auditing the class. I'm here because I have an interest in this subject," he said. Luza was surrounded by the group of girls, but at the same time, he also suffered from the killing looks from the guys in the classroom. The girls only left once the class started, but even during the lesson, Luza kept receiving notes on which either their mobile number or WeChat ID was written. In the afternoon, Luza went to the hospital to collect his medical report. For some reason, he waited at the reception window for a while, but the female hospital worker kept dawdling and just would not give him his report. Eventually, thanks to the physician Li Wei he had met last time, he obtained his report. Before he could leave the hospital, Li Wei held on to his arm and told him that she was leaving early from work, and would like to buy him dinner. Before Luzu could reject her offer, Li Wei had already dragged him to a fancy Hunan restaurant. "Hi, I'd like to order this, and this. All of these dishes must be spicy." Li Wei took the menu and ordered just like how she would usually do. However, she then immediately looked at Luzu and asked, "Do you like spicy food?" Luzu nodded, "I am fine with it. In fact, I actually do like my food to be a little spicy." "But, aren't doctors supposed to be more particular about their food? How come you like such spicy food?" Li Wei replied with a question of her own. "Who told you that spicy food is bad for your health? You doctors usually tell us to watch our diet and not eat spicy or oily foods. That's only when you are sick. It is fine to eat these things when you are well." It was interesting talking to Li Wei. She was an aggressive and outspoken lady, and was 2 years older than Luzu. She spoke her mind and was very direct, so Luzu would not need to guess what she really meant, which made him feel really at ease. Compared to Kai Jiajia, who was reserved and graceful, Li Wei was someone on the other end of the spectrum. Lu Zhi had taken the initiative to go after Kai Jia, but now Li Wei was going after him. The feeling was different, better somehow. In any case, Lu Zhi was enjoying every moment of it. "Hi, 2 more bottles of beer please." "More." Lu Zhi knew what was on Li Wei's mind. However, when both of them left the restaurant, it was Lu Zhi who carried Li Wei out. Taking off her white coat, Li Wei did not have an athletic figure from years of exercises like Kai Jia, but she was still mature and hot. In particular, when she pressed herself against Lu Zhi, he felt as though his whole body was burning. "Where do you live? I will take you home." "It's alright. There is a hotel nearby. Just get me a room there." After checking in the room with Li Wei, Lu Zhi did not come out until the following morning, when both of them left the hotel together, behaving very intimately. Lu Zhi found it thrilling to date a female doctor who was 2 years older than him. Lu Zhi felt that something was about to grow out from between his eyebrows. Finally, at the end of his meditation, with sufficient mind power, the thing broke through and came into the real world. Lu Zhi saw the external world, not with his eyes or with the introspective senses that he had been using earlier. Instead, he was actually observing the world from an entirely different angle. His mind power had broken through the limitations of his body and was influencing the real world. The real world that he saw through his mind power was made up of information formed by dots and lines. There were no colors or light, only information in the form of dots and lines. From the moment Lu Zhi extended his mind power to explore the world, he could feel a vast amount of external information flooding into his brain. The humidity of the air, the size of the room, and the length, structure, quality, and density of his bed all continuously gushed into his brain. Suddenly, Lu Zhi realized that he had never understood his room so well. However, the huge amount of information was too much for him to handle, causing him to feel as if his brain was going to explode. Is this how the world looks like using mind power? The world is created from information. After withdrawing his mind power, Lu Zhi felt dizzy at once. Information from the whole world kept entering his brain. Although he enjoyed the feeling, he found it unbearable at the same time. After Lu Zhi calmed down, he started to carry out his initial plan. He began to observe the inside of his body and the deep parts of his cells, just like how the queen insects did. His mind power turned more refined and went deeper into his body. Lu Zhi could see his body become continuously enlarged. He saw his muscles, blood vessels, blood, and then, his cells flowing. They looked like bubbles that converged into an endless stream of river, rushing into the distance. As Lu Zhi's mind power ventured even further, he could see what was happening inside the cells. He found the nucleus, which was the small walnut-shaped tissue in every cell. The function of each cell was carried out by its cytoplasm, while the nucleus was its core. Lu Zhi once again made his mind power even finer. At this stage, it was already extremely tough for him. His mind power had reached the realm of the microscopic world. This was the most magical and mysterious corner of the world. As compared to the macroscopic universe, humans were more interested in the microscopic world. Finally, Lu Zhi saw his own DNA. It was like a spiral staircase, and contained the greatest secret of the human body. Human genetic materials were found here, as was all the information in the body. This was a mystery that mankind had always wanted to unravel but could not do so completely. Lu Zhi was elated. He went straight in and saw an endless amount of information flooding into his brain in the form of visible texts. He felt as though he was standing naked in front of a long stream of information. An infinite amount of information dating all the way back to the beginning of life presented itself beneath his feet. What is this? The memories of life? Lu Zhi saw the information about his ancestors and the beginning of mankind. As he moved up the stream, Lu Zhi could even see the shadows of people which were his ancestors. As he advanced further, their faces became simpler and unadorned. Their clothing also kept changing, and ultimately, he saw the primitive period. He moved all the way from Homo sapiens to Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and Australopithecus. Then, Luzu realized that the road ended abruptly. This was the first template of man and no more genetic backtracking was available. Perhaps, this was actually the origin of man. The other species further up the stream already had nothing to do with mankind. Luzu could see directly the origin and evolution of man. It was like an enormous slideshow which greatly astounded him. At the moment Luzu withdrew his mind power, he felt wobbly, nearly falling down from his bed. He covered his face and panted non-stop. It took him a long while to recover. After some time, Luzu roared with laughter. He felt that he had been to the edge of the evolution of man, and finally understood the secret of genes. Luzu realized that the insects had actually changed their genes through pheromones after observing the secret of genes. Luzu had a more frightening thought, all because he had seen the genetic template of the ape-like ancestor in the deepest part of his genes. What if I change the template? If I change the source of the genetic information and tell the gene that its ancestor is not an ape, but rather a titan, or a god, or even a dragon in the legend, what will happen to mankind? Will it cause atavism, with man suddenly becoming extraordinary beings? The thought thrilled Luzu, but he also felt that the task would be extremely challenging. Countless experiments would have to be done before he could realize his goal. Luzu was not even sure if it was feasible. Luzu had set up a laboratory upstairs. It was not professional, but he had bought many pieces of biology-related equipment, which were expensive and hard to get. Fortunately, he only required a few basic facilities, as his mind power was much more powerful in terms of accuracy and fine-tuning. In particular, during observations, Luzu could accurately detect the changes in the experiment. There were a CO2 incubator, biological safety cabinet, ultra-low temperature freezer, and other equipment, as well as a wide range of consumables. Luzu had used up all of his money, including the funds that his parents had left behind for him, in order to purchase all these items. When Luzu made the investment, he had asked his primary school classmate, Wang Yi, for help. Luzu attended primary school in his hometown. Back then, both of them had lived only a few hundred meters away from each other, and they were on good terms. Wang Yi was currently working as an assistant in a research institution that was jointly owned by a pharmaceutical company and the university. Luzu and Wang Yi had not seen each other for a long time, so Wang Yi was rather amazed when Luzu suddenly contacted him. Luzu started his experiment with mice. That was right. A pitiful mouse lay on the lab bench, and Luzu started to play with the root genetic template of the species according to his own imagination. However, every time he altered it, the entire genetic chain would collapse at once. The blood in the culture flasks would also lose its bioactivity and was unable to tolerate such random alterations. Luzu realized that the root genetic template must be logical. It must be something that he could understand too, or else it would result in a chain reaction that would cause the genes to collapse. He started to try putting the information of the human's root template into the animals. After a few trials, Luzu successfully created the genes of mouse people, a hybrid between mice and humans. Using polymerase chain reaction, Luzu immediately duplicated the genes of the mouse people, using which he created the first generation evolution plasma. He named it the mouse people blood plasma. However, when Luzu exultantly injected the plasma into the bone marrow of the mouse, it exploded right away. Immediately, Luzu's heart sank. After being depressed for quite a while, Luzu felt that he might be able to breed a new generation of life from the embryo, instead of directly and brutally trying to modify the genes of a mature animal. It would just be like the way clone sheep were created. At this time, a tremendous change in the painting space was noticed. Hey, what has happened? Why are you all dead? Luzu had been too busy over these few days to observe the painting space, and when he looked at it, he found that a huge amount of insects had started dying. Luzu realized that 2 days ago, the insects had actually developed bioenergy. A queen insect had created a new generation of nests and begun to continuously spawn soldier insects. It then managed to control all the other queen insects, effectively unifying the entire painting space. After that, the queen insect that had just unified its world went on to a road of self-destruction, The endless creation of soldiers eventually used up all the resources of the painting space. The seas had been contaminated and dried up, and the lands had turned into mere deserts. The insects had started to devour one another, resulting in continued deaths. Luza saw for himself the total collapse of the huge civilization of insects. The queen insects and ordinary insects died one after another, and the painting space was being ruined. No. Don't die. Luza nearly went berserk. However, the measure on the silver sigil in his brain continued to rise rapidly as the insects died. Finally, the measure broke through its bottleneck. Luza could feel the silver sigil transform from a horizontal layer to a silver-colored hourglass. At once, a huge amount of information charged into his brain, and Luza, once again, received part of the information on how to manipulate the scroll of the world. Specifically, he received the method on how to create and open the dimensional channel from the outside world. Luza glanced into the painting space, which had already turned into a desert. Even the dead bodies of the insects were being devoured gradually. However, Luza realized that the queen insect that had controlled the painting space had disappeared. It did not die and actually just vanished. What has happened? After some prompt investigation, Luza realized that it was at the point when his control of the space had been enhanced that there was instability in the dimensional channel. As he was adjusting the dimensional channel in an attempt to save the painting space from total destruction, the queen insect had grasped hold of the opportunity to escape from the painting space, exiting the two-dimensional world. However, Luza had no idea where she had escaped to, or whether it was a lower dimensional space or a higher dimensional one. She might even have escaped to the three-dimensional space where he was currently in. Has she escaped? This trickster destroyed my painting space and just disappeared. This is too rude. Luza felt the loss, but there was nothing he could do. He knew that this would eventually happen one day, given the characteristics of insects. These extremely aggressive insects would devour all resources in order to enhance their lives. The painting space was just too small for them. After the living things in the painting space all died, Luza retrieved the source form from it, which filled up only around 1/10 of the hourglass. If Luza's original measure when he had first obtained the painting space was 100 units, the quantity of the source form at the moment would be about 1,300 units. To fill it up again, he would need 10,000 units of source form. Previously, Luza had used 100 units of source form to create the painting space. Now that he had 1,300 units, he might be able to come up with another plan to create a more stable, larger space. Perhaps, it would even be a world that could accommodate various civilizations and living things. Luza suddenly realized that he had missed out an important detail. He could trace back the memories and origin of his ancestors through his genes. Hence, the queen insects might be able to do so as well. That would mean they might have already discovered that they did not belong to the painting world. Instead, they were from another universe and their ancestors were but a group of ants on the ground. Luza's expression changed. Could the insects have already felt my presence, and have been scolding me behind my back? Something also seems to be wrong with the queen insect. It seemed like she has prepared to escape from the painting space long ago. At the moment, in a distant and unknown inner space, the queen insect that had curled up like a worm and traveled through space-time in a cocoon sent out a wave. The world of God. CC, looking for the presence of God. We insects are from the world of God, the kingdom of God. The Almighty God, Sunuka is looking for you. I have many questions. As Luza waited outside the hospital, a few women suddenly came by to chat him up, but he rejected them. When Luza saw them walking away reluctantly, he could only smile wryly. At the moment Li Wei appeared, he immediately waved at her. Li Wei smiled and bid her colleagues farewell, after which she leapt into Luza's embrace. Noticing a few female doctors and nurses gossiping at the door, Luza held Li Wei in his arms and said, "This is a public place. Don't be so affectionate. Your colleagues are all watching us with a scary look." Li Wei gave a humph and said, "They are trying to seduce you and are envious of me. In the future, don't look for me inside the hospital, just give me a call when you are here." Luza shrugged and said, "All right, Alright. I've got it. I promise that I'll be good and not fool around. Li Wei said proudly, that's right. As my man, you have to be virtuous. Lu Zhu opened the door of his car and Li Wei sat on the passenger seat. Then, Lu Zhu made one round and hopped into the car as well. After he started the engine, he said, I didn't know that you get jealous so easily. You're so petty. By the way, the word virtuous is used for women. Li Wei immediately argued, who asked me to fall in love with such a handsome guy like you? If I am not careful, those vixens outside will swarm you. Over this period, Lu Zhu had gradually understood why women were so attracted to him. Other than his outstanding look, another important factor was the smell of hormones that exuded from his body. When his body had adjusted to the optimum level, Lu Zhu realized that not only could his physique be compared to professional athletes, but his now perfectly healthy and balanced body also released this smell that would attract women greatly. This was something that Lu Zhu had no solution to. He could not possibly destroy his physical attributes only because of such a small flaw. Moreover, if this was even considered a flaw, all the men in the world would most likely want to have it. After going through the ordinary process of having their dinner, going on a date, and watching a movie, Lu Zhu brought Li Wei to his house. This was the first time that Li Wei went to his house. They had been to the hotel a few times together and then to Li Wei's house, but not Lu Zhu's house. Your house is quite nice. It is detached and the location is great. Did your family refuse to leave when the developers tried to chase you out in the past? I am surprised they allowed you to stay. Li Wei's guess was somewhat close to the truth. As Lu Zhu's house was situated at a corner, after rejecting the offer for a few times, the developers had given up and did not demolish the house without their consent. At night, after the exhausted Li Wei took a shower, she saw Lu Zhu who only had a towel around him watching television on his sofa. She quietly came up from behind, hugged him, and said, "You're great." Lu Zhu pulled her down onto the sofa and laughed. Am I that great? After playing around with each other, Li Wei asked, It has been quite a while since you resigned from your job in the capital. What's your plan? Lu Zhu pondered for a while and replied, I plan to open a pet shop. What do you think? Oh? Do you like pets? Lu Zhu came up with plans for the future of the painting space based on his ideas. Since he had 1,368 units of source form, Lu Zhu had decided to create a world with a bigger framework of rules, so that he would not need to keep changing and adjusting it in the future. Of course, that was merely the framework. Lu Zhu would not be able to design a large-scale world for the time being even if he wanted to. Lu Zhu had spent a long time thinking about it. Initially, he had thought about the universe, planes, parallel worlds, worlds with different timelines, gaming worlds and many others. But in the end, Lu Zhu realized that making these worlds into a reality would be too difficult. In the end, Lu Zhu adopted a more practical type of space, a space world. The space world was made up of multiple planes and was completely different from any of the worlds found within his universe. Anything outside of these planes could be considered the ethereal sea or astral plane. Lu Zhu had thought of implementing the concept of the immortal heroes or an element of fantasy, but after some thought, realized that he would need a much bigger framework. It would be difficult for him to control and set up such a world. Most importantly, Lu Zhu was fearful that a cool guy might appear within the world he created and come after his life in the other dimension, claiming that he could slay God or whatnot. That thought was just to humor himself though. The setup for the immortal heroes would be closer to his current personal cultivation system. What Lu Zhu wanted was a system that could motivate its people to cultivate their abilities, a system that would bring about the enhancement of civilization. A world like this would help him to harvest source form, yet not make its people too powerful. Ideally, a system of gradual enhancement would be better for Lu Zhu. Thus, Lu Zhu would like to set up a world with low amounts of magic that could complement science. This would provide him with a continuous supply of source form as well as large amounts of new, improved thoughts and ideas. After all, he was currently the only one doing the work, and thus, naturally had limited ideas. It was better to be able to gather the ideas from a larger group of people. As it was now, Lucy had gotten whatever source form he had currently from the few ants he created in the past. After filling up an entire notebook with plans and setups, he closed it and took out the scroll of the world. He opened it to see that there was nothing on the scroll. The world within the scroll had become a barren desert with nothing left. Lucy closed his eyes and cupped his face. He directed his consciousness into the map, linking it up with the silver hourglass and taking control of the space within. He could immediately see that the situation inside the map starting to change. The world within the painting space kept reducing in size, eventually becoming pitch black. It was as if a huge dark vortex had consumed everything. As the painting world changed, Lucy could sense a cran space world being formed in the scroll. The initial world in the painting space had been reduced to a black dot, a tiny bubble. It then gradually moved from the center of the world to a corner. Lucy exhaled and opened his eyes. He knew that the procedures had gone smoothly. However, the measure of source form in his brain had instantly dropped by 930 units, leaving him with only 438 units. Merely setting up the framework for this new world had used up a large amount of source form. Lucy turned pale when he saw this, as the source form had been hard to get. He had to be more prudent. Lucy used his mind power again and saw that, at the center of the scroll, a bubble had been formed within the dark vortex. The structure of the space had been stabilized by Lucy. He would have to fill the space with material energy in order to decide just how large the world would be. Lucy went to the rooftop, where he saw a strange symbol. It looked very complex, like the blueprints of a building where all the details from the exterior to the interior was clearly stated. After spending a few days on it, Lucy finally managed to draw it out. Lucy had gained control of the method to open the dimensional door when he acquired the rights to control the space within the painting. The painting itself was meaningless. The most important thing was the guidance for his mind power. Lucy had to follow the blueprints and inject his mind power into the space in order to activate the dimensional door. Everything remained unchanged even after he injected the mind power. However, his mind power could sense the vibrations under his feet. The instant Lucy completed the structure using his mind power, he saw a giant black hole under his feet, extending and spreading all the way up into the sky. Boom! At this instant, all of the people in the world stopped whatever they were doing, not knowing what to do. The sky had turned dark, leaving the entire world in darkness. What happened? Is there an eclipse? Why did the sky turn dark so suddenly? A few scientists from the Institute of Astronomy, Chinese Academy of Sciences gathered together and wondered aloud, what's going on? Why is there a sudden eclipse? We did not predict such a situation. It is not an eclipse. Not an eclipse, how is that possible? What's going on? It looks as though the light from the sun has vanished. A group of people in uniforms were gathered together. They were from NASA. Among them were Caucasians, Asians, and Africans. A few guys were typing on their keyboards, while the rest of them stared blankly at the big screen, commented among themselves. This is not a natural phenomenon. Something is devouring the energy from the sun. Devouring the energy from the sun? How is that possible? Are you crazy? I would like to say that I am crazy, but that is what the data shows. What is the area that has been affected? Is this man-made? The area has not been confirmed, but we can be sure that it affects the entire planet, possibly even parts of the solar system. Man-made? If this could be done by a person, then it would have to be God. Oh my God, the entire Earth can be easily destroyed by this person in an instant. It might be done by an alien. At the same time, the Netherlands Institute for Astronomy, other astronomical institutions around the world, and the space sectors were also caught by surprise by the sudden change in the sky. Many of them looked out, only to see the entire world covered in darkness. The traffic patterns were in chaos, people on the streets screamed and squatted down. The darkness brought fear to them all. Many of them turned on the lights and looked up at the sky. Using their mobile phones and binoculars, they tried to catch glimpses of the eclipse, but nothing could be seen. Why can't I use my phone? What's the problem? The light has dimmed. The internet has been cut off. Those that knew the true cause of the darkness were struck by panic. The energy from the sun had been devoured and the world had descended into darkness, yet no one knew the reason for it, nor could they guess when everything would return to normal. Should this continue, the order and stability of the human civilization would crumble within a few days. The human race would die off in less than a month. My God, is this the end of the world? It has not recovered yet. Just what's going on? What is the reason for this? We must find out. We cannot lose the sun. Is this punishment from God? Luzu, who was currently on the rooftop of his house, instantly tried closing the entrance of the dimensional door. He had wanted to open the entrance completely, but did not expect how powerful the energy-devouring capabilities of the massive entrance was, as well as the impact it had. The entire sky had turned dark. This was much more than what Lucy had wished for when he tried to absorb energy from the outside world. After a few minutes, Lucy finally managed to close the entrance. The world became bright again. Lucy could not help but wipe the cold sweat off his face. Fortunately, Lucy had set up the dimensional door to absorb energy, and was directed at the sky. If he had directed it to the ground, if he had aimed it under his feet, Lucy was worried that even the planet might have been devoured. Lucy heaved a sigh of relief as he saw the color gradually returning to the sky. He did not know how large the area of influence was, or if he would attract the attention of the rest of the people. Lucy would never have known that by releasing the dimensional channel and allowing it to devour the photons of light according to his requirements, he had put the entire planet into darkness for more than 10 minutes. This had caused the world's institutions to become panic-stricken. Everyone was now guessing if the cause of the phenomenon just now. Was it a natural phenomenon, or God playing a joke on them? Lucy looked at the space within the scroll of the world. He had never thought that the planes could be blown up like a balloon. It was so huge that Lucy could not even see the boundary of the plane. It seemed boundless. Lucy felt as though it was a real world. Lucy could feel a large amount of energy and matter welling within the plane. He could simply apply the rules and he would have been able to sculpt this world to how he wanted it to look like and create the world that he wanted. Lucy started to work on the most crucial step. It was similar to how he set up the previous world. He revamped the rules and immediately, the sky, land, sea, sun, moon, stars, gravity, air, clouds and wind appeared on the plane. Lucy sowed the seeds that he had prepared in advance, and under the acceleration of time, they started to grow and proliferate. Very soon, the greenery had filled the earth. Lucy could sense that this world would no longer reject the introduction of larger creatures. This was because the plane was sufficiently stable and large. He no longer limited to only putting insects into this world, since he could now freely insert other living things, including himself. However, Lucy had no intention to enter the painting space at the moment, as he still had no idea if this world was suitable for living for both man and animals. Although he was the one that had created this world, he had done so using the powers of the scroll of the world, the silver hourglass that was in his brain and the foolproof methods of operation, and not by his own powers. The power did not belong to him, and hence, he should not consider himself to be omnipotent like God. If he did that, Lucy would be too pretentious. It was similar to how Lucy could, in theory, tap into the power of the scroll of the world to destroy the world and bring it to an end. However, that did not mean that he had the actual ability to do so. A 3-year-old holding the button to launch nuclear weapons could also destroy the world, but does that mean that he is in control of nuclear power? Could the 3-year-old freely control its power? Currently, Lucy was like the 3-year-old child with the button to launching the nuclear weapons, but he had no insane intentions of pressing the button, nor did he have the guts to conquer the world and become its leader. All he wanted to do was to fulfill his dreams and goals using this weapon. As such, he had been exploring on how he could completely transform the power of the scroll into his own power. It was as though Lucy was using a gigantic hand to draw on the painting space. But he realized that the acceleration of time he implemented began to slow down after it peaked at 10,000 times that of normal. It seemed as though the required amounts of energy in order to maintain the acceleration of time would increase the more complete and complex the world was. When the plants started to grow, Luza realized that time had gradually slowed down from 10,000 times that of normal to about 9,000 times. This downward trend seemed to continue. The dimensions of the space seemed to have been enhanced from the time I created the painting space. This current space can be known as the dimensional space. Although it has not been upgraded to the level of the three-dimensional universe, the structure and rules of this world are more complete than the previous one. When the structure and rules become more complete, the criteria for time acceleration becomes stricter. Hence, I will not be able to change it as I like. Luza was suddenly enlightened. After the rules had been set, the measure of the source form Luza possessed dropped down to 108 units. Luza did not force the world to return to his desired flow of time, that would require a large amount of source form in order to change the rules. This was because he no longer had enough source form to use. He also had to reserve some for special circumstances. Luza looked at the huge current space in the scroll of the world. It was empty except for two bubbles, one big and one small. The small one was the previous painting space, which had become a barren world. The big one was the newly created world. Let's call you Maria's world. We shall let the goddess of light, Maria, create the world. Luza gave the new plane a name and started the initial setup. He wrote down the words, Maria's world, in his notebook. After that, he proceeded to the next step of his plan, which was to let Maria's world have a complete ecosystem. He would like to form a world that could contain different living things, not one that could only support the weird life forms of insects like the previous world. Yesterday, before dawn, there was an eclipse. The experts have said that this could be a one-time. The eclipse had caused the country to slip into chaos. An unidentified magnetic field had appeared and caused the world's communications network to go down in a mere 10 minutes. It is very rare to see a global eclipse. Luza held Li Wei's hand and watched the news in the hall of a pet shop. The news was broadcasting on what had taken place the day before. Luza had not expected his actions to have such a large impact. It had affected the whole world. However, Luza felt that it was to be expected when he thought about the vast space in Maria's world. Li Wei was playing with her mobile phone, which she then passed to Luza. Look, there are a lot of rumors on the internet. Yesterday, there was a commotion in the hospital when the sky suddenly turned dark. But it does not seem to have been an eclipse. Luza gave an awkward smile. He had read the news. Many people were certain that it was not an eclipse. At that point of time, the orbits of the Earth, Moon, and Sun did not meet the conditions of an eclipse. Moreover, more than one area had been affected. In fact, the entire world had been affected, with every corner of it having lost its light. With all of the different views going around, many people were making guesses and many discussions were being held. Other than the televisions and mainstream media's speculation on the eclipse and other rumors, many scientists and students, who were studying astronomy, stood up to express their views. There were even many people who speculated that it was a warning of an alien invasion on Earth. Some said a god was going to destroy the world, and that this was a rehearsal. There were far-fetched information circulating amongst the population, but most of these information were not of too large a concern to an average person. Most of the people took it as a joke. As Luza was hugging Li Wei and looking at the phone, the door of a room in the pet shop was pushed open. A middle-aged owner took out a contract and said, "It is ready. Please take a look. I have all the equipment and facilities. The pet grooming equipment and renovations are still in good condition. But you might need a pet groomer. If you need recommendations from me, I will be happy to help. I can even introduce you to suppliers." Luza was elated, and said, "Really? That will be great." This pet shop was not far away from Luza's home. There were small communities and parks nearby, making the area and location quite desirable. Furthermore, Luza liked the style of the decor in the checkered imitation wood flooring. It had a rather ecological style, a little cartoonish, yet refreshing as though they were in a natural setting. The space was also rather large, about 80 square meters in size, After Luzu looked around and made up his mind, he managed to get the price reduced greatly, as he knew the thoughts of the owner. "I will keep the name of the shop, Cats and Dogs Pet Shop. For the renovation, just a bit of a touch-up will do," Luzu said after giving it some thought. The owner needed a week to hand it over, so Luzu could only take over the shop after a week. He decided to take a break during this period. Luzu drove alone to Shenangjia, Muayu town. Although this was not the peak season for traveling, the town was bustling with people from all walks of life. There were people distributing leaflets, as well as shops holding various events to attract customers. There were many performances at night as well. After enjoying himself, Luzu settled into a hotel. He went up to the mountains the following day. He had chosen a less traveled path, so that he could select different kinds of plants, animals, and materials for Maria's world. This would complete the selection of animal and plant species in Maria's world as well as its ecosystem. Luzu had tried to put a mouse into Maria's world, into one of its 5 different continents. By this time, the seeds of the plants that he had sowed had spread across the entire world. The air seemed to be much fresher than what Luzu had imagined, and the mouse lived comfortably. There were even types of algae that Luzu had never seen before growing in the sea. These plants had all grown naturally on their own. Luzu had introduced large amounts of different species of fish, as well as stray dogs and cats into Maria's world. There was already a small group being formed. However, the cats and dogs had turned feral. The fish had proliferated in the ocean. As Luzu had sealed up the zero-dimensional channel, the creatures did not share the same conditions as the insects, so they evolved under normal conditions. Luzu had been a little obsessed with Maria's world recently. He had manically purchased seeds of different plants. He would also take with him species of bugs, birds or animals he had never seen before in order to enrich the diversity of living things in Maria's world. Luzu left it for nature to decide if they would survive or not. It was survival of the fittest. Luzu did not wish to allow every race in Maria's world to share the zero-dimension channel or freely pass through the authority he had over that space to extract the energy within the zero-dimension space. At the very least, he wanted to prevent the creatures from drawing on that energy without him allowing it. His intention was to release control of the zero-dimensional channel gradually in the future via his own methods. He did not want a repeat of how the insects freely used the energy for their own developments. Shenangjia was a World Cultural Heritage Site. When they first applied for the title, its success hinged upon having a lot of natural resources, such as animals and plants. To Luzu, this was a massive treasure trove. There were 11 types of vegetation distributed around Shenangjia. It was one of the 3 largest distribution centers for seed-bearing plants in China. Empirical research had confirmed that there were at least 3,767 vascular plant species in Shenangjia, 590 temperate plant genres, 205 local species, 2 unique genus, and 1793 species unique to China. Many rare animal species had also been preserved in the ecosystem. In fact, it had been recorded that there were more than 600 vertebrate animal species, including 92 types of mammals, 399 bird species, 55 types of fish, 53 types of reptiles and 37 types of amphibians. Its mountainous terrain had even become the habitat of some endangered species. It had been recorded that there were more than 1,300 golden snub-nosed monkeys, leopards, white cranes, white snakes, great bustards, giant salamanders, and more found in this place. In total, there are 67 types of wild animals that were under the protection of the country. This place was also a haven to different types of insects. Currently, 4,365 species had been found. As Luzu moved along, he collected the resources that he needed with the help of his mind power and strong physique. He had collected grasshoppers, different types of snakes, monkeys and Asiatic black bears. He had no idea if it was legal or not, or if what he was doing was immoral, but since no one was watching, he couldn't care less. It was nice to be able to move around freely and fearlessly in the forest, especially when one had a strong physique. Walking freely in the forest like that had never crossed Lucy's mind. He would not be able to do so under his previous poor health condition. Moreover, without his mind power to anticipate danger, his constantly uptight nerves would have made him very fatigued. After all, Shenangjia was not a safe place and was filled with danger. Without the help of his mind power to explore the area, Lucy would not have been able to find the animals and plant species that he needed so quickly. He had also found a few old ginseng gatherings, as well as some rare herbs, which he carefully tucked away. Along the way, Lucy continued to migrate the various uprooted plants. He also found traces of wild animal species as he continued on the journey. He followed the trails, found them, then put them into Maria's world. After Lucy dug up the nest of moles and tossed them into Maria's world, he saw the footprints of a bear on a path nearby. Some of its fur had fallen to the ground and Lucy was surprised to see that it was white in color. "Hey, what have we found here? An adult albino bear that has lost its way. Let's try to catch it. An albino bear can give us." Lucy laughed out loud as he was thinking to himself. These past few days, he had caught many animals from Shenangjia. He had run after these ferocious animals, like tigers, leopards, and bobcats, with the scroll of the world in his hands. He did not even spare the monkeys. Even a bear would pose no threat to him, so Lucy was in high spirits. Lucy used his mind power to explore the footprints and collect information about the bear. According to his estimates, the bear most likely had been here half a day ago and should still be around here somewhere. Indeed, after tracking it for some time, Lucy finally found the albino bear in an uphill area of the forest. An albino bear was a rare albino species of the Asiatic black bear. There were less than 10 existing in the whole world. It was very different from the polar bear. Its fur was not as white, in fact, it was highlighted with a little brown. As Lucy watched the albino bear, he realized that it seemed to be pregnant. It was probably grumpy at the moment. It would be easily agitated should Lucy approach it. The ears of the bear were standing upright, attached to its rather big head, its tail was hiding between its butt, making it look quite cute. However, when it turned around, its ferocious expression and sharp teeth shows that it was not to be messed with. But Lucy was no ordinary man. He dashed out toward the albino bear with his scroll of the world. The bear was shocked at first, then became enraged. It stood up and roared furiously at Lucy. The sound of its roar filled the entire forest, alarming the birds and animals. Leaves even fell down onto the ground. Lucy did not hold back. He aimed the scroll of the world at the albino bear and absorbed it inside the scroll. He threw the albino bear near the Asiatic black bears that he had captured earlier. After all, Lucy could not miss this opportunity to capture a pregnant bear. It was like a buy one, get one free type of thing. Without realizing it, Lucy had stayed in Shenangjia for a week. He had spent the week drinking fresh spring water and enjoying the roasted meat of the animals that he had hunted inside his tent. He had enjoyed the relaxing life. He was even able to communicate with some of the animals in Shenangjia using his mind power. However, they had little intelligence and their thought processes were very scattered. Sometimes, they would not answer questions posed to them, but Lucy still found it all very interesting. Lucy knew that it was time for him to leave. He had collected enough species of animals and plants, a good number of which have now been proliferating widely within Maria's world. This was especially so for the plants. The fact that Shenangjia had so many plants had helped Lucy complete the plant ecosystem in Maria's world. The ecosystem had gradually taken shape, but comparatively, the rules and completion of the world had slowed down its flow of time, reducing it to approximately 7,000 folds. Lucy prepared to leave now that he had reached his target. After all, he had many tasks awaiting him back home. He packed his belongings and looked at his map. Lucy walked toward the direction of Laojun Mountain. Walking in that direction would allow him to find his way and return home successfully. This route was said to be among the favorite hiking trails taken by tourists. The road was more developed and safer, offering assurance that he would have a smooth journey home. On his way, Luzu saw a group of tourists taking pictures of some monkeys. They looked cute and had captured everyone's attention. Luzu also took out his camera and started to take pictures of the monkeys. If not for the people around, he might even have captured a few of them. But one of the tourists seemed to have agitated the monkeys while he was feeding them, prompting the monkeys to start attacking the people. These monkeys had sharp claws and teeth, able to pull off a piece of flesh with every scratch. They scratched the male tourist at a number of places. The male tourist cried out pitifully. Another man from the group tried to save him, but his actions only agitated the monkeys further, causing them to start throwing stones at the people. At this moment, Luzu stepped out and blew on his whistle, causing the monkeys to run away, as if they had encountered their mortal enemy. All of the people in the group shifted their attentions to Luzu. A few girls, who had been frightened by the violent encounter just now, turned to look at Luzu. Luzu looked nonchalant. He kept the whistle as he saw that the monkeys had run away. That was just a gimmick tool that he had used when he was hunting for the animals. He would blow on the whistle whenever he came across animals that he did not wish to capture, or those that he had captured before. He did this to catch their attention, and at the same time, used his mind power to release an aura of a predator in order to scare the animals away. To an average person, what he had done looked amazing. Luzu looked at the few tourists who had been injured by the monkeys and asked, "How are you? Is everything fine? I have a first aid kit. Do you need it?" At this moment, the tour guide stepped forward and said to Luzu, "Thank you. We have a first aid kit with us. I am the tour guide, Zukai." Luzu shook his hand and said, "I am Luzu. I also came on a trip. I was just passing by and am glad to be of help." Zukai sent a few people to tend to the injured tourists. Most of them were not seriously wounded, but the wounds looked gory and frightening. The tourists continued to look at Luzu with curiosity. He looked gorgeous, and a few female tourists could not take their eyes off of him. After Zukai had settled the tourists, he went to Luzu and offered him a packet of cigarettes. "Would you like to have a puff?" Luzu had had weak lungs since his youth, and thus had never smoked. He immediately rejected the offer and Zukai kept his cigarette, also refraining from smoking for the time being. He was chatting with Luzu when suddenly, Luzu saw a strange stone on the ground, as big as the size of his fist. He bent over and picked it up. This stone seemed to have been thrown by the monkeys just now. There was still mud on it, probably due to it having just been dug out. Luzu gave the stone a closer observation and found that it looked round and pretty. There were even some large cracks on the stone. Zukai took a look and said, "Hey, this looks like a fossilized dinosaur egg." Luzu looked at Zukai with excitement and asked, "What? A dinosaur egg? Really?" Zukai nodded and said, "It should be. I have seen things like this before. An ordinary dinosaur egg only costs a few thousand yuan, and while it is not very expensive, it is a good collector's item. What you have here should be a dinosaur egg, but I do not know what dinosaur it is from. It does not look too big, so it should not be from a huge dinosaur." Luzu nodded his head. Regardless of the type of dinosaur it was still a dinosaur, and this was its egg. "Is there really a dinosaur egg here?" Immediately, a few tourists came over and stood beside Luzu to take a look. Luzu shared the dinosaur egg with them, letting them inspect it. He had found it, and according to Zukai, it was not expensive. More importantly, this was something unique and worth collecting. Everyone was amazed by the fossilized dinosaur egg, as if they could see from it how the overlords of the world millions of years ago looked like within the egg. After they returned it to Luzu, he carefully stored it away. As some of the tourists were injured, the group decided not to continue with the hike. They took a shortcut, boarded the bus and went to a nearby clinic to get treated. After all, they had been clawed by the monkeys and would not want to contract any viruses or infections. Luzu left Shenanjia with the group and got along well with them. These people loved to travel and were mostly outgoing and cheerful. Everyone took pictures with Luzu, which brightened up his trip even more. Although the few girls in the group were not very pretty, they were very candid and not pretentious. They took many pictures with Luzu. A fat girl even kissed him out of nowhere, causing his shocked look at that moment to be captured by the camera. The entire journey back home was filled with much laughter. Before they departed, Zukai gave Luzi his mobile number, along with an invitation. "We are from Hubei province, and we usually conduct tours and organize some projects. You can join us if you are interested. Our events are very interesting." Luzi nodded and said, "I like that idea. I will definitely join you if I have the time." After signing the contract, settling the payments, and dealing with some documentation, the ownership of the pet shop had been transferred to Luzu. The documentation for the pet shop was rather simple and only ended up costing a few hundred yuan. Luzu started becoming busy after taking over the pet shop. He got a contractor to carry out some minor renovations for him, and just like that, the new cats and dogs pet shop was ready for business. The previous owner had left his pet groomer in Luzu's employ, and since she was experienced, she was also familiar with how to tend to the pet store. She had been a great help to Luzu, who was new to the business. "Jala, thanks for helping me. I am new to the business and have many areas to learn and handle. Do feel free to come to me if you have any problems." "Yes, boss." A girl with curly hair said politely to Luzu. After bidding goodbye, the girl turned toward the road and disappeared into the crowd. Luzu finally ended his first day of business after a busy day at work. He had not yet sold any pets, but there were many customers who had brought their pets for grooming and a bath. Jala was rather young, but loved pets. She was also very good at trimming the fur of the pets. Every untidy looking cat or dog that came in left the store looking like a model. Luzu stayed later that evening at his pet shop, spending some time reading his book before heading home. Once home, he went straight to his laboratory that he had set up. But at this point in time, the laboratory was empty. He took out the scroll of the world and spread it out, revealing the current space within. The current space looked different. There was now an additional tiny bubble that was not visible to the naked eye. This bubble was a small dimensional plane that Luzi had created for himself. The space within it was very small, only about 1,000 square meters. The space was about the size of a house, and was filled with stones, which had been fitted together to form 9 levels. Its style took after Western historical architecture and resembled a castle. The small dimensional plane was not independent. It was embedded above Maria's world, their surfaces latching tightly on each other. The internal resource circulation system as well as the energy, and even the air, were all extracted from within Maria's world. Hence, it was not an independent world. Luzi had used only 3 scales from the source form to complete the small dimensional space. He planned to use it as his secret base, and he called it the Dimensional Castle. Luzi kept the scroll of the world and looked at the floor. There was a complex magic circle on the floor. He injected his mind power and activated the dimensional door. As his shadow flickered, he disappeared from the earth and entered the dimensional castle. The moment he appeared in the dimensional castle, the lights rapidly turned on and the entire place lit up. Luzi stood on the first level of the hall, feeling a little lost. He looked at the crystal lightings, the decorations on the wall, as well as the switches. Some of the decorations was created using source form, some bought on Earth by Luzi, and some obtained from within Maria's world. They were then put together when he created the rules for this space, and it had now turned into a castle. This was the first time that Luzi had entered the inner parts of the space in the scroll of the world. It was only when he stood there, that he felt that the world he had created was not a sham or an illusion, but rather, that it truly existed. Luzi looked at the glass that was mounted at the top of the huge living room and light it refracted. He explored the surroundings and walked up to the second level. He saw the rooms, which had been constructed according to his blueprint. However, there were not many furnishings except for the basics. After all, even with his source form, Luzi could only create what he understood. Luzi knew that he had to use the source form sparingly, even if it was only 0.0001. The source form was the world's most basic form of energy. Without the scroll of the world, there was no way that Luzi would be able to come into contact with such a high-level existence. As one went up the levels, there was a conference hall, library, restaurant, indoor swimming pool, restroom, bedroom, laboratory and prison. There was even a botanical garden at the very top level. There were 5 levels above the ground floor, and 4 levels down to the basement. The entire place was big beyond imagination. The current power supply was produced by a diesel generator, which was just sufficient enough for operation. Lucia suddenly had another thought. The queen insect had left behind a bionuclear energy machine in the painting space. It had been hidden in the inner parts of the hive that has since dried up. It could devour any substance, even water, and turn it into nuclear energy. Previously, the queen insect, Suniga, had relied on it to keep up the insect's rush strategy and control the world. However, this thing was dangerous even though it had no intelligence or consciousness. Luzu only had the thought in his mind. It would take a long while for him to realize this thought. Luzu went up to the top floor, which had rounded glass ceilings revealing the sky overhead. He intended to make this place a botanical garden, but it was currently empty. He switched on the light, revealing a translucent protective layer outside the glass. That was the wall of the plane. Ordinary people would not be able to go near him or touch him. Those who entered would automatically be turned back. The folds in the space made one feel as though he was in a maze. Outside the multiple folds of the wall of plane was the ethereal sea, or the astral world. This place was void of anything, and no living thing could survive within it. After touring the dimensional castle, Luzu returned to the bedroom that he had prepared for himself. He took out the scroll of the world and hung it on the wall. Unless there was a need, Luzu would not take the scroll of the world away from this place. After all, this would be the safest place to keep it. Since he had full control over the scroll, it did not matter where the scroll was. He could easily access it using the dimensional door. After adjusting the angle of the map, Luzu saw Maria's world continuously being enlarged. One of the green continents gradually appeared before his eyes. Luzu saw a group of undersized human figures in the valley. These fellows had short white fur, long beards, small eyes, and their limbs had evolved, now similar to those of a human. This was the result of Luzu's experiment, the mouse people. Luzu had created an intelligent race, which had formed a colony in Maria's world. Luzu had implanted the genes of a mouse onto the genetic template of a human in order to create the genes of the mouse people. Following that, he created an artificial embryo through genetic engineering, which he then impregnated a dog with. He had never expected to successfully create an intelligent race from it. The adult mouse people were about 1.3 meters tall and were in the era of a primitive society. They were able to use tools and fire, and they made their clothes out of animal skins. They possessed the things necessary for the beginnings of a civilization. Luzu observed their behaviors and looks through the scroll of the world. His pupils were dilated, as though he was witnessing the miracles of life. I never thought that I could create intelligent beings. Luzu felt as though he had reached the realm of God. In basement 2 of the dimensional castle, Luzu stood before a huge beehive-like thing. He felt somewhat short-handed after beginning to carry out his plan. Therefore, he immediately took out the smallest insect nest from the painting space and placed it in basement 2. Since Luzu was not a queen ant, he did not have the mental ability to control all the insects and be the superior ruler in terms of genes. Luzu's mental talent was information transmittance. That is, he could transmit a huge amount of information through his mind power, which not everyone could. Every individual who had entered the zero-dimensional inner space would have his mental talent awakened. Luzu only discovered this after observing the queen insect. His talent was different from the queen insect's. If an ordinary insect had not entered the zero-dimensional world, but only had its consciousness awakened by extracting source form, its mind power would only act as a special sensory organ. It would not be able to transmit information, or sense and modify genetic information like what Luzu had done. Only beings such as Luzu and the queen insect who had entered the zero-dimensional world before could do such things. In addition, there was a great difference between the mental talent of the queen insect and that of Luzu. Luzu named the queen insect's mental talent as insect control, and his as information transmission. Although he could not control all the insects like the queen insect, he could still create and control part of the insects via the nest. A species like insects would only be scary with a queen. Without a queen insect, the ordinary insects would pose no threat to Luzu, because they were not intelligent at all and would only carry out their given duties mindlessly, from the time they were born until the day they died. This was the life of the ordinary insects. As long as Luzu had control over the nest, he could make changes to the pheromones when he created insects. In this way, he could create the types of soldiers he wanted, and they would take orders from him. However, Luzu was not a queen insect, and the nest was also partially damaged. Therefore, he clearly could not create insects endlessly like the queen insect. At the very most, he could create only a few insect servants. Moreover, Luzu did not think very highly of the insects as they had such a low intelligence. Those races with high intelligences would contain a large amount of source form. Among the insects, there was a significant polarization between the ordinary insects and the queen insect. However, beings such as the queen insect were too terrifying for him to have. After activating the nest, Luzu could see that the nest devoured at once the compounds which he had placed within it. After a short while, many black slimy balls were born from the nest and they struggled to approach Luzu. They looked like aliens, they had black shells, slender bodies, big heads and eyes, and antennas on their heads. These were the ant people created by Luzu. This second generation nest was very powerful and these insects that had just been created were all already mature. At the moment they were born, they could go straight to the battlefield and become continuous consumables. The ant people popped into existence one after another. Very soon, Luzu saw 30 to 40 ant people, each almost 2 meters tall, stand before him. They knelt down on the floor to receive orders from him. Using his mind power, Luzu could not sense any four-dimensional waves. These ant people had extremely low intelligences and almost no self-awareness. They would only act according to the instructions given to them by the queen insect. At the moment, Luzu became their highest commander. Of course, should the queen insect of the nest appear, it would be able to take control of the ant people right away. With his mind power, Luzu injected various tasks, processes, and precautionary measures into the brains of the ant people. Then, they started to line up and walked out from the basement in an orderly manner. They acted according to the tasks given to them by Luzu. Some were in charge of cleaning up the place, while others were in charge of construction. Every ant person had its own task to carry out. Luzu heaved a sigh of relief. With the help of these ant people, he would be relieved of many tasks, allowing him to then carry out his plan accordingly. With the creation of the 40 ant people, the internal energy of the nest had been totally depleted and it stopped working again. Then, Luzu walked out from the basement as well. Also, he locked the metal gate outside basement too. The thing inside was really too dangerous. With the ant people, the castle looked somewhat more lively. They moved around, busying themselves with their tasks. They tidied up and decorated the castle, and created many furnitures and utensils. Before long, the once empty castle was filled up with things. The resting area was on the 3rd level. The shelves in the library here had been constructed, but they were still empty. Luzu planned to fill them up with books gradually in the future. At the moment, Luzu was at the back of the library which could be reached by walking along the corridor outside. He was sitting on a wooden chair, reading a book. Suddenly, an ant person appeared, and Luzu quickly stood up. Although the ant person did not say a word, Luzu knew from the four-dimensional wave released from its antennas that the constructions in the castle had been completed. In particular, the prison at level 1 and the laboratory at level 4 had been built. Luzu first went to level 4 to take a look at the laboratory, after which he walked to level 1 to inspect the prison. At the end of the stone prison, there was an area that looked like a huge altar. On the floor, there was a picture of the channeling array for the dimensional door. However, Luzu was already more experienced now. Even without the array, he could still carve it out with his mind power. The altar was surrounded by the prison gates and looked like a special prison cell. This was a special transmission formation that Lucy had prepared to capture the beasts in Maria's world. He stood on the altar with two ant people, and when the doors of the cell were closed, they disappeared together from the altar. Lucy appeared on top of a hillside. Behind him, there was a big stretch of forest, while at the foot of the hill there was a vast prairie. A large river flowed mightily from the valley below his feet into the distance. Many animals were drinking by the side of the river. Birds were chirping in the woods, and as a goshawk flew past, the rabbits in the grass hurriedly ran away. Lucy could see numerous familiar species, many of which had been brought into the world by him earlier. There were also some that he could not recognize. In this large piece of land, many species had evolved into new ones as they adapted to the different environment over many centuries. Herds of sheep and cattle were moving on the prairie, while wolves and jackals were hunting for their prey. The blue sky was embedded with white clouds, and there was a high concentration of oxygen in the air. The entire world seemed to be uncivilized and yet full of vitality. Lucy and the ant people went downhill to the river. The animals quickly ran away, looking strangely at the two-legged monster with weird clothing before them. Lucy stepped into the river and looked at the fish in the clear water. Then, he lifted up his head and grinned. "This is Maria's world." Lucy put on a white lab coat and watched in much anticipation as a wolf gave birth to its 4 newborn pups. He glanced at the wolf, which gradually sank into deep sleep. This was a knack he had using his mind power. It was hypnotism, which he had only learned recently. Then, Lucy opened the cage, went in, and carried the pups out. The small pups had 4 limbs, just like mankind. Other than their wolf ears and short tails, they looked just like human babies. "I have successfully bred the wolf people too." Lucy stood up. Along the 2 sides of the long stone corridor, there were closely fitted prisons, caged with tigers, dogs, cats, lynxes, bears, and other wild animals. As he walked past the animals, they roared madly, and some even charged towards the cage doors. However, after Lucy left and closed the iron gates, all the roaring sounds died down. He carried the pups up, away from the prison in basement 1 which Lucy had created. He went all the way up the stairs to the laboratory in level 4, where one of the lights was lit. Lucy walked in through the door. The room had white walls and warm lighting. Many small baby cots filled up the big room, and some strange figures were moving around. They were the ant people, who were taking care of the pups inside the room. Every cot had been labeled with a serial number, together with the pup's race and gender. These ant people would be bringing the pups up, which would become the very first generation of the orcs. They would form the beginning of the orcs. Lucy hoped that every race would be able to multiply in Maria's world. Every one of them would be a new race, a miracle of life. Lucy had checked their brains and found that they were similar to mankind. They were very developed, and he was certain that their intelligence levels were also comparable to mankind. Lucy counted and checked the health conditions of all the pups. The ant people would be monitoring the pups around the clock. Everything seemed to be good at the moment. The various races of orcs that had been born included wolf, fox, tiger, cat, dog, bear, sheep, and several others. Including the mouse people, there were a total of 18 races. However, this was far from enough. In Lucy's vision, the human race had to be present as well. Lucy had no intention of duplicating and incorporating the humans on Earth into Maria's world, as it would be meaningless and uninteresting. Instead, he wanted to create a human race that was totally different. Lucy had stayed in the dimensional castle for a few months and was somewhat drained of energy and enthusiasm. Although what he was doing was extremely exciting, it was very stressful to be living in such an environment alone. The orcs had been successfully bred. With the ant people around to take care of them, Lucy had nothing to worry about. After a few years, he would let the first generation of the orcs return to the wild and carry out their mission, which was to form their own civilized tribes. However, it was no longer necessary for him to stay here. He only needed to return to the outside world and wait patiently. When Lucy returned to the outside world through the dimensional door, he realized that it was still in the night. Although he had stayed in the dimensional castle for a long while, Back in the outside world, only tens of minutes had passed. Luza could have stayed inside for decades, used up his lifespan, and become old, but here, in the outside world, only 2 to 3 days would have passed. This made him realize even more clearly that he was not God, but rather just an ordinary, lucky man. As he opened the window and lay on his bed, he gazed at the stars outside. The urban air was much less fresh than the air in Maria's world, and the starry sky was also not as brilliant as the one which Luza had created. However, Luza felt more comfortable and familiar here. After lying on his bed for only a short while, the phone rang. He took his mobile phone and realized that Sci-Fi was calling him. When he answered the call, Sci-Fi's youthful voice was immediately heard. However, it was filled with anger. She shouted at Luzu, "Luzu, why did you not reply to my WeChat? You also ignored my messages." Luzu looked at his mobile, seeing now that there were really many message notifications. He immediately said, "I didn't notice them. At night, I usually read all my messages together and reply at once." "What's up?" Sci-Fi shouted right away, "I know you have forgotten. Tomorrow is my birthday, my birthday." Luza suddenly recalled he had promised Sci-Fi that he would attend her birthday party. However, he had been so busy and had forgotten about it. In addition, he was not really keen to attend a party with just students, but since he had promised Sci-Fi, he had to go. "Who told you I have forgotten?" "I remember. It is still early." Sci-Fi exposed him and said, "If I did not remind you, you would not have shown up tomorrow. Let me tell you this. You have to come tomorrow, if not, I will come to your house and bite you to death." Luza found himself quite dirty. When Sci-Fi said that she would bite him, he became distracted and started fantasizing. "All right, I know. Send the address over. I will be there on time. Don't forget my present." The following afternoon, Luza drove his car out onto the streets. After searching for quite a while, he still could not decide what to get for Sci-Fi. Should he get her a necklace, or a bangle? He did not want to give her something that would cause any misunderstanding. In the end, he chose a Dassault lady's watch for her. It was not the biggest brand, and cost around 4,000 yuan. This was not too expensive and also quite appropriate. By the time he reached the site of the party, a mid-range restaurant by the riverside, it was already dusk. After checking with the staff, he went up to a private room at level 2 where Sci-Fi was in. Before he even reached the room, he could already hear noisy cheers and laughters from it. He opened the door at once and looked inside. As Luza stuck his head in, he saw everyone looking at him. Many girls started to scream, with one of them shouting, "Hey! Handsome, who are you looking for? Is this Sci-Fi's?" The moment Luza spoke, Sci-Fi jumped up and shouted, "I'm here. You are finally here. I was about to call you." There were many people mingling about, with many couples. Most of them were students. Sci-Fi rushed up to Luzu and hugged him. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, after which she held his arm and said, "Let me introduce you to my boyfriend, Luzu. See? I did not lie to you. He is very good looking." Luza dropped his jaw and looked at Sci-Fi. When did he become her boyfriend? As he was about to raise his hand to explain himself, Sci-Fi whispered in his ear, "I have already boasted to my friends that I have found a super handsome boyfriend. You better not make me look bad and lose my reputation. If you do so, I would die."